In the heart of the Columbia River Gorge lies one of Oregon's most stunning natural wonders. The Eagle Creek Trail draws thousands of hikers each year with its breathtaking waterfalls and dramatic cliffside paths. But on March 16, 2009, this picturesque hiking destination became the scene of a mystery that would haunt investigators and divide a family for years to come. When 23-year-old Rhonda Casto set out that morning with her boyfriend Stephen Nichols, she was looking forward to a day in nature. A stunning young woman with dreams of modeling success and a 9-month-old daughter at home. Rhonda had everything to live for. By nightfall, she would be dead. Her body discovered at the bottom of a 150-foot cliff. What happened on that rain-soaked trail has become one of the most controversial cases in Oregon's recent history. Was it a tragic accident on a notoriously dangerous path, a desperate act of suicide by a troubled young mother, or something far more sinister? The investigation would span years, cross international borders, and tear apart the very fabric of a family already struggling with grief. At its center stands Stephen Nichols, a man whose story has changed more times than the weather on that fateful March day. His account of what transpired would evolve from a simple slip-and-fall accident to suggestions of suicide, leaving investigators and family members questioning everything they thought they knew. Rhonda's mother, Julia Simmons, never wavered in her belief that something wasn't right about her daughter's death. From the moment she received that devastating phone call, Julia suspected that the man who claimed to love Rhonda might have been responsible for her demise. Her relentless pursuit of the truth would eventually lead to murder charges being filed 6 years after Rhonda's death. But Stephen Nichols had a different story to tell. The day trader turned English teacher maintained his innocence while painting a disturbing picture of Rhonda's mental state. According to Nichols, Rhonda was battling severe depression and had a history of drug abuse that few people knew about. He claimed she had spoken of death repeatedly and had even attempted suicide on multiple occasions. The case would become even more complex when investigators uncovered a web of relationships and allegations that painted Nichols in an increasingly dark light. There were accusations of inappropriate relationships with minors, including Rhonda's own younger sister. There were claims of domestic violence and controlling behavior, and hanging over everything was the shadow of $1 million life insurance policy that both Rhonda and Stephen had taken out on each other just months before her death. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the beautiful hiking trail held more secrets than anyone had imagined. The physical evidence was limited, the witness testimony conflicting, and the truth seemed to shift like shadows on the forest floor. What started as a straightforward accident investigation evolved into a complex murder case that would challenge everything investigators thought they knew about reading crime scenes and human nature. The Eagle Creek Trail itself became a character in this unfolding drama. Known for its narrow paths, slippery conditions, and dramatic drop-offs, the trail had a reputation for being both beautiful and dangerous. Experienced hikers knew to exercise caution, especially during Oregon's notoriously wet spring weather. But was the trail dangerous enough to claim the life of a young, healthy woman who had supposedly been there before? Stephen Nichols would eventually flee the country with his daughter, starting a new life in China where he found work as an English teacher and even got engaged to a local woman. For years, it seemed like he had escaped justice, building a new family while Rhonda's loved ones struggled with unanswered questions and unresolved grief. But the long arm of the law would eventually catch up with him. In 2015, when Nichols returned to the United States to get married, he was arrested at San Francisco International Airport. The charges murder in the first degree. The case that had gone cold was suddenly red hot again. and Nichols found himself facing the possibility of life in prison. The arrest sent shockwaves through both Oregon and China, where Nichols had built his new life. His Chinese fiancée was left devastated. His daughter was placed in state custody, and the man who thought he had escaped his past found himself at the center of a media firestorm that would scrutinize every aspect of his character and his relationship with Rhonda. What followed was a legal battle that would last for years, with both sides presenting dramatically different versions of what happened on that March day in 2009. The prosecution painted a picture of a controlling, manipulative man who killed his girlfriend for insurance money and to cover up his inappropriate relationships. The defense argued that Rhonda's death was nothing more than a tragic accident on a trail known for its dangers. But perhaps the most shocking development came when Stephen Nichols himself began to tell a new story. In interviews with investigators and media, he started to suggest that Rhonda's death might have been suicide. He claimed that she had been deeply depressed, struggling with drug addiction, and had even told him she didn't expect to live past the age of 25. This revelation added yet another layer to an already complex case. If Rhonda had indeed taken her own life, it would explain the lack of physical evidence pointing to murder. But it would also mean that Stephen Nichols had allowed himself to be charged with murder rather than reveal what he claimed to know about Rhonda's mental state. Was this the act of a man protecting his deceased girlfriend's reputation? Or was it simply another lie in a long string of deceptions? The case would ultimately hinge on more than just what happened on the trail that day. It would require investigators and eventually a jury to parse through years of conflicting testimony, to weigh allegations of abuse and misconduct, and to determine whether a man's changing story represented the evolution of truth or the desperate attempts of a guilty conscience to avoid responsibility. As we delve deeper into this mystery, we'll examine the evidence piece by piece, hear from the key players in this tragic drama, and try to understand how a simple hiking trip became the center of one of Oregon's most controversial criminal cases. The truth about what happened at Eagle Creek may be more complex than anyone imagined. The tragedy that unfolded on Eagle Creek Trail began years before that fateful March morning in 2009. The relationship between Rhonda Casto and Stephen Nichols was anything but the fairy tale romance some might have imagined from the outside. They had met in 2005 when Rhonda, just 20 years old and stunningly beautiful, answered an online advertisement for a roommate. Stephen, 10 years her senior and recently divorced, was renting out rooms in his 3-bedroom condo just outside Portland. What started as a landlord-tenant relationship quickly blossomed into something more intimate. Stephen was immediately captivated by Rhonda's beauty. She was working as an aspiring model, building a portfolio with professional photographs that showcased her striking features. But those who knew Rhonda well understood that her beauty was just one facet of a complex young woman with big dreams and an independent spirit. The couple's relationship moved quickly. Within months, Rhonda had moved from being a tenant to being Stephen's live-in girlfriend. Her mother, Julia Simmons, and younger sister Tessa also moved into the condo, creating an unconventional household arrangement that would later become significant to the investigation. For the first few years, friends and family described the couple as happy. Stephen seemed charming and successful in his work as a day trader. He had money, status, and seemed genuinely devoted to Rhonda. But those closest to Rhonda began to notice troubling signs as time went on. In 2008, 3 years into their relationship, Rhonda gave birth to a daughter. The arrival of their child should have been a joyous milestone, but instead, it seemed to mark the beginning of a downward spiral in their relationship. Rhonda had gained weight during her pregnancy, and was struggling with what friends later described as postpartum depression. Rhonda's best friend, Jessica Colburn, witnessed the relationship's deterioration firsthand. She later recalled how Rhonda had confided in her about increasing tensions with Stephen. There were arguments about money, about Rhonda's weight, about their future together. What had once seemed like a loving partnership was becoming strained and volatile. The financial pressures were mounting as well. Stephen's day trading business had suffered significant losses, with some reports suggesting he had lost as much as $250,000 in the year before Rhonda's death. The couple was struggling to maintain their lifestyle, and there were disagreements about spending and financial priorities. It was during this difficult period that Stephen suggested they take out life insurance policies on each other. According to Stephen, it was Rhonda who insisted on the insurance, claiming she wanted to leave something for their daughter in case anything happened to her. But Rhonda's family would later argue that it was Stephen who pushed for the policies, seeing them as a solution to his mounting financial problems. Each policy was worth $1 million, a substantial sum that would later become central to the prosecution's theory of motive. The timing was suspicious to investigators. The policies were purchased just months before Rhonda's death, during a period when their relationship was at its most troubled. Friends noticed other concerning changes in Stephen's behavior during this time. He had become increasingly controlling, monitoring Rhonda's activities and limiting her contact with friends and family. Jessica Colburn later testified that Rhonda had told her about physical altercations with Stephen, describing incidents where he had been violent toward her. The relationship was further complicated by allegations that would later emerge about Stephen's inappropriate conduct with other family members. These allegations painted a picture of a man whose behavior toward women, particularly younger women, was deeply troubling. While Stephen would eventually admit to some inappropriate conduct, he would deny the most serious accusations. Despite the problems in their relationship, Rhonda seemed to be trying to make things work. She was focused on losing the weight she had gained during pregnancy and was hoping to restart her modeling career. Friends described her as still being hopeful about the future. Even as she confided her concerns about Stephen's behavior, the idea for the hiking trips came up as part of Rhonda's effort to get back in shape. Stephen later claimed that they had made a pact to hike 20 to 25 of Oregon's top trails together, as a way to spend time together while helping Rhonda lose weight. But Jessica Colburn would later testify that Rhonda had only mentioned plans for one specific hike, the one that would prove to be her last. As March 2009 approached, the tensions in the relationship were reaching a breaking point. There were fights about money, about Stephen's alleged infidelities, and about their future together. Rhonda had confided to friends that she was considering leaving Stephen and taking their daughter with her. It was against this backdrop of relationship turmoil, financial stress, and mounting tensions that Rhonda and Stephen set out for Eagle Creek Trail on that March morning. What Rhonda expected to be a simple day hike would instead become the final chapter of her young life. The morning started normally enough. They woke early and decided to take advantage of what appeared to be good weather for hiking. Rhonda seemed to be in good spirits, according to Stephen's later accounts. She even jokingly called herself Supergirl as they prepared for the hike. But according to Stephen's evolving accounts of that day, Rhonda also asked him disturbing questions about what would happen to their daughter if something happened to her. These alleged conversations would later become key elements in Stephen's changing narrative about Rhonda's mental state and her possible intentions that day. The couple arrived at the Eagle Creek trailhead and began their hike on what was known to be one of Oregon's most beautiful but also most dangerous trails. The narrow path winds along steep cliffs with dramatic drop-offs, and even experienced hikers know to exercise extreme caution, especially during wet weather. What happened next would become the subject of years of investigation, legal proceedings, and public debate. The investigation into Rhonda's death began immediately. When Stephen made that frantic call to emergency services, reporting that his girlfriend had fallen from the cliff, the initial response was to treat it as a tragic hiking accident. Eagle Creek Trail was well known for its dangers, and falls, while rare, were not unheard of. But almost from the moment the investigation began, something didn't sit right with those who knew Rhonda best. Her mother, Julia, was among the first to express doubts about Stephen's account. She knew her daughter was an experienced hiker who was familiar with the trail. More importantly, she knew about the problems in Rhonda and Stephen's relationship. The physical evidence at the scene was limited but telling. There was no large skid mark on the trail where Rhonda supposedly slipped. Instead, investigators found only a single footprint at the edge of the cliff. For prosecutors, this would become a crucial piece of evidence suggesting that Rhonda had not accidentally slipped, but had either jumped or been pushed. The medical examiner's findings added another layer to the mystery. Dr. Christopher Young determined that Rhonda's injuries were concentrated primarily below the waist. Her pelvis was shattered, and the pattern of injuries suggested she had landed feet first. This was consistent with either a jump or a fall where someone had gone over the edge upright, rather than tumbling head over heels, as might be expected from an accidental slip, for months. The investigation proceeded slowly. Detectives interviewed witnesses, examined the scene repeatedly, and tried to piece together what had happened in those final moments. But without additional evidence or witnesses, the case began to grow cold. Stephen, meanwhile, appeared to be moving on with his life remarkably quickly. Friends and family members noted that he didn't seem to be grieving in the way they would expect from someone who had lost the love of his life. Within months of Rhonda's death, he was making plans to leave Oregon entirely. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators began looking more closely at Stephen's background and his relationship with Rhonda's family. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of a man whose behavior toward women, particularly younger women, was deeply problematic. The most shocking revelation involved Rhonda's younger sister, Melanie, who was just 15 when she first met Stephen. According to court documents and witness testimony, Stephen had engaged in inappropriate sexual conduct with Melanie while he was in a relationship with Rhonda. The relationship had continued on and off for years, creating a devastating betrayal that Rhonda had only recently discovered. Text messages recovered from Rhonda's phone showed that she had confronted her sister about the relationship just hours before her death. The messages revealed Rhonda's anger and hurt over the betrayal, adding another dimension to the possible motive for murder. But Stephen's troubled history didn't end there. Investigators uncovered allegations from his ex-wife, who claimed that during their marriage while living in China, Stephen had tried to throw her over the balcony of their 8th-floor apartment. Though no charges were filed in that incident, it established a disturbing pattern of alleged violence against women. There were also allegations involving a 13-year-old girl that Stephen had encountered on a bus after Rhonda's death. While he would eventually plead guilty to sexual harassment in that case, the pattern of inappropriate behavior toward minors was becoming impossible to ignore. In 2013, 4 years after Rhonda's death, and with no charges filed, Stephen made a dramatic decision. He packed up his belongings, took his daughter, and moved to China, where he had lived before meeting Rhonda, in Wuxi, about 75 miles from Shanghai. Stephen found work teaching English to Chinese businessmen and began building a new life. Stephen thrived in China, eventually falling in love with Landy Yin, a Chinese woman who became like a mother to his daughter. The little girl, now speaking fluent Mandarin, seemed to be adjusting well to their new life. Stephen even proposed to Landy, and they were making plans to marry both in America and China to make their union official in both countries. But while Stephen was building his new life in China, Rhonda's family was working tirelessly to keep her case alive. Julia Simmons continued to call investigators, demanding answers and refusing to let her daughter's case be forgotten. Her persistence would prove crucial to what came next. In April 2014, a secret grand jury heard evidence in the case and returned an indictment charging Stephen Nichols with the murder of Rhonda Casto. The indictment remained sealed for months while authorities planned Stephen's arrest. When Stephen returned to the United States in February 2015 to prepare for his wedding to Landy, he walked directly into a trap. At San Francisco International Airport, instead of catching his connecting flight to Oregon, he was separated from his daughter and placed under arrest for murder. The arrest was devastating for everyone involved. Stephen's daughter, now 6 years old, was placed in state custody while Stephen was extradited to Oregon to face trial. Landy, who had followed Stephen to America for their wedding, found herself stranded in a foreign country while the man she loved faced life in prison. For Rhonda's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and renewed grief. After 6 years of waiting for justice, they finally felt that someone was taking their concerns seriously. But the legal battle was just beginning, and the path to justice would prove to be far more complicated than anyone anticipated. Stephen's defense attorney, Mike Arnold, immediately began building a case around the dangerous nature of Eagle Creek Trail. Arnold argued that Rhonda's death was nothing more than a tragic accident on a trail known for its hazards. He pointed to the lack of physical evidence linking Stephen to any crime and argued that the prosecution's case was built on speculation and character assassination rather than facts. But as the case moved toward trial, Stephen himself began telling a different story. In interviews with investigators and later with the media, he started suggesting that Rhonda's death might have been suicide. He claimed that Rhonda had been deeply depressed, struggling with drug addiction, and had told him repeatedly that she didn't expect to live past the age of 25. This new narrative added yet another layer of complexity to an already convoluted case. If Rhonda had indeed taken her own life, it would explain the single footprint at the cliff's edge and the lack of evidence pointing to murder. But it would also mean that Stephen had allowed himself to be charged with murder rather than reveal what he claimed to know about Rhonda's mental state. The case seemed destined for trial, with both sides preparing their arguments and witness lists. But in May 2017, in a shocking turn of events, Stephen accepted a plea deal. Rather than face trial for murder, he pleaded guilty to criminally negligent homicide and coercion. The plea deal was devastating for Rhonda's family, who felt cheated out of their day in court. Julia Simmons broke down in tears when she learned of the agreement, feeling that justice had been denied. But for prosecutors, the deal represented a pragmatic recognition that their case, while compelling, might not be strong enough to guarantee a murder conviction. Under the terms of the plea agreement, Stephen was sentenced to time served plus 3 years of probation. Having already spent more than 2 years in jail awaiting trial, he was effectively a free man. Though he remained under supervision and was required to stay in Oregon until his probation expired in 2020. The resolution of the criminal case brought little closure to those who loved Rhonda. Her family remained convinced that Stephen had murdered her and gotten away with it. Stephen, for his part, maintained that his plea was simply a pragmatic decision to ensure he could regain custody of his daughter and move on with his life. Today, the mystery of what happened at Eagle Creek remains unsolved in the minds of many. The narrow trail continues to attract hikers from around the world, drawn by its natural beauty despite its reputation for danger. But for those who knew Rhonda Casto, the trail will forever be marked by tragedy and unanswered questions. Stephen Nichols returned to China after completing his probation. Though his relationship with Landy had ended during his legal troubles, his daughter, now a teenager, remains in the custody of the state. And Stephen's chances of regaining custody appear slim, given his guilty pleas to various charges involving inappropriate conduct with minors. The case serves as a reminder of how complex criminal investigations can become when physical evidence is limited, and human relationships are complicated by betrayal, financial pressure, and personal dysfunction. It also highlights the challenges faced by families seeking justice when the legal system must balance the pursuit of truth with the practical realities of what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Whether Rhonda Casto slipped, jumped, or was pushed from Eagle Creek Trail on that March day in 2009 may never be definitively known. But her story continues to resonate as a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly normal relationships, and the importance of listening to those who raise concerns about domestic violence and abuse. The mystery at Eagle Creek remains a testament to Rhonda's memory and her family's unwavering love, even as questions about what really happened that day continue to haunt all those touched by this tragic story. On the surface, November 18, 2010 looked like a normal Thursday morning in suburban Atlanta. The sky was clear, the air calm, and families were caught up in their usual morning routines, preparing lunches and hurrying to drop the kids off at school. In the Snyderman household, Rusty Snyderman was doing just that. After breakfast with his family, he kissed his wife goodbye, loaded his 2-year-old son Ian into the car, buckled him in, and drove to Dunwoody Prep, a small daycare center in a safe, middle-class neighborhood. Rusty, 36 years old, is a Harvard graduate entrepreneur. He has built a stable and successful life for his wife, Andrea, and their 2 children, Ian and Sophia. Friends described him as charming, loyal, energetic, and endlessly optimistic. He took great pride in his role as a father, always present and enthusiastic in caring for his children. But as he walked Ian into daycare that morning, an unseen danger was stalking him after dropping Ian off and exchanging pleasantries with other parents. Rusty made his way back to his car. Suddenly, the quiet morning shattered. A man emerged, raised a gun, and fired 3 shots at close range. One bullet struck Rusty in the neck, and he collapsed onto the asphalt as horrified parents and teachers froze in shock. Blood surrounded him as he lay motionless. He didn't scream or struggle. It was an abrupt, calculated killing. The shooter then calmly walked back to his silver van and drove away. Rusty died instantly, just steps from the daycare playground. Close enough for the children to hear, but his son Ian remained inside, safe and unaware that he'd just said goodbye to his father for the last time. The city of Dunwoody was in shock. Who would carry out such a bold and brutal murder in broad daylight, in front of children, and why? Who could want Rusty dead? As investigators delved into Rusty's life, they uncovered a web of secrets darker and more complex than anyone had imagined. It was a story entangled with infidelity, manipulation, obsession, and ultimately, murder. The truth unveiled a world where appearances were deceiving and no one could be trusted. Rusty Snyderman was born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, in a close-knit, loving Jewish family. From an early age, he was marked by charm, humor, and kindness. As the youngest in his family, Rusty grew up surrounded by love, high expectations, and strong traditions. He thrived academically, but his greatest gift was the way he made others feel valued and understood. By his teenage years, Rusty had developed a knack for leadership. He organized school events, volunteered, and built enduring friendships. Success wasn't his sole pursuit. He earned respect through his compassion and determination. After graduating high school, Rusty went on to Indiana University, where he formed a lifelong bond with Josh Gollum, one of his closest friends. It was during these college years that Rusty's life took a defining turn. One evening, after a relaxing night out, Rusty meets a wonderful girl, Andrea Robin Greenberg. She is smart, ambitious, and very beautiful, and Rusty is instantly attracted to her. Their bond was intense from the start. Their relationship deepened quickly, with friends noting how hard and fast Rusty had fallen for her. After graduating, Rusty pursued an MBA at Harvard Business School, one of the most prestigious programs in the nation. He worked relentlessly, motivated by his dream of building a stable and meaningful life for his future family. After earning his degree, he married Andrea, and they moved to Atlanta, Georgia, to create the life they had long envisioned. Rusty embarked on a career in finance, eventually becoming a trusted wealth manager and business consultant. His clients valued his expertise, and his colleagues respected him. Rusty approached his work with integrity, prioritizing relationships over transactions. When Andrea gave birth to their daughter Sophia, followed by their son Ian, Rusty's sense of purpose deepened. In the suburban neighborhood of Dunwoody, the Snydermans were viewed as the picture-perfect American family. They were kind, friendly, and actively involved in the community. The kind of neighbors everyone was glad to have. Rusty took pride in their home and the life he and Andrea had built together. He adored Andrea and fully supported her aspirations. When Andrea decided to rejoin the workforce after spending time at home with their children, Rusty stood by her wholeheartedly. He encouraged her to apply for a position at General Electric GE, where she became a project manager and reported directly to a senior executive named Hemi Newman. Andrea's new job required frequent travel, including conferences, business trips, and late-night meetings. Rusty willingly took on more parenting responsibilities and remained proud of her achievements, confident in their relationship. But over time, things began to change. Andrea's travel increased, and she appeared more distracted and distant. Rusty still tried to support her, but it was hard for him to ignore some of the signs, like the late-night phone calls, the vague explanations, and the change in her demeanor. Despite these red flags, Rusty remained silent. He trusted Andrea and believed in the life they had built. Unbeknownst to Rusty, Andrea's professional relationship with her boss, Hemi Newman, had crossed a line. Hemi had grown infatuated with her, and their work lives began to overlap with their personal ones. At the time, Rusty was focused on his children and career. To outsiders, the Snydermans seemed like a stable, happy family. Behind closed doors, however, a dangerous dynamic was forming, one Rusty was entirely unaware of. The tragedy that followed didn't begin with a gunshot. It began with trust. Trust from a man who loved deeply, valued loyalty, and centered his life on family. Rusty had a thriving career, 2 beloved children, and a wife he deeply cherished. His life was full of meaning and joy, yet all of it would be snatched away in a devastating instant. The man responsible had already entered their lives. Hemi Newman wasn't someone who instantly raised red flags. On paper, he is an experienced, intelligent engineer who takes on a leadership role at General Electric Energy in Atlanta, where he manages more than 5,000 employees. Colleagues described him as intelligent, confident, and occasionally arrogant. But beneath his polished facade, Hemi was unraveling. Though married with 2 children, his personal life was far from stable. Outwardly, he seemed successful, but privately, he was grappling with unhappiness. His marriage was crumbling, financial stress was mounting, and he appeared emotionally lost. His wife began to suspect him when he became cold, irritable, and unapproachable. And then, Andrea entered his life. Andrea Snyderman stood out at GE from the beginning. She was attractive, confident, and articulate. A woman who excelled in meetings, traveled seamlessly, and carried herself with ease. She laughed freely and admired Hemi in a way that felt absent in his own marriage, and he became captivated by her. Initially, Hemi and Andrea's relationship was purely business. However, over time, it evolved. First subtly, then intensely. They spent countless hours collaborating on presentations, attending conferences, and often sharing meals or drinks at hotel bars after meetings. Their work travels took them to places like Lake Tahoe, Denver, London, and even Edinburgh Castle in Scotland. To those around them, their connection seemed far more personal than business-related. Andrea later denied having an affair. She claimed that Hemi's feelings were unrequited, that she only saw him as a friend, and any closeness was misinterpreted. However, others have a different perspective. According to them, this relationship is emotional, flirtatious, and sometimes goes further, beyond work boundaries. Meanwhile, Rusty remained oblivious. Though aware of Andrea's frequent travel, he trusted her deeply. However, in the days leading up to his murder, Rusty grew uneasy. He noticed a suspicious man lingering near their home, a man wearing a hat, a fake mustache, and earmuffs. Alarmed by the man's presence, Rusty called 911. Rusty mentioned to the operator that he thought the man had a gun in his back pocket. His voice was steady but anxious, as he explained that he didn't know who the man was, but emphasized that he didn't want the man near his house. What Rusty couldn't know was that the stranger outside was Hemi, in disguise, preparing to kill him. 8 days later, Hemi followed Rusty to the Dunwoody Prep Daycare Center, where Hemi shot him at point-blank range in front of horrified parents and teachers. How did a successful and respected executive become a murderer? The answer reveals disturbing complexities. In police custody, Hemi confessed to the murder but claimed that he wasn't in control of his actions. He explained that he suffered from hallucinations and hearing voices. One voice, resembling Barry White, urged him to kill himself. Investigators were shocked. Hemi's calm demeanor during the interrogation added to their unease. Despite his claims of mental illness, he appeared composed, methodical, and even rehearsed. While admitting to the crime, he attempted to frame it as a result of psychological turmoil. Throughout the interrogation, one name kept surfacing: Andrea. Hemi told police that he was in love with her, believing they were soulmates. He described how she confided in him about her troubled marriage, and how their emotional connection gave him hope for a future together. Andrea, however, denied any romantic involvement. She stated that Hemi had overstepped boundaries, making unwanted advances, which she had firmly rejected. She maintained that she only saw him as a colleague, but Hemi's phone records contradicted her claims. In the 6 months leading up to Rusty's murder, Andrea and Hemi exchanged more than 1,400 calls and text messages. Their emails suggested emotional, if not romantic, intimacy. In one such email, Hemi even proposed marriage. Andrea dismissed this as silly and inappropriate, testifying that she had told him to stop and made it clear his advances were unwelcome. Yet, she had allowed him into her hotel room during work trips. traveled alone with him, confided in him, arranged to pick him up from the airport, and even moved her seat on planes to sit beside him. She never mentioned any of this to Rusty. Hemi's wife, Ariella Newman, also felt that the relationship was not strictly professional. Ariella eventually filed for separation, but by then, it was too late. Hemi had already purchased the .40 caliber handgun that would ultimately end Rusty's life. A gun dealer later testified that Hemi had approached him, claiming he needed a firearm for home protection. After the murder, Hemi contacted the same dealer again, this time to ask about how to dispose of the gun for the police. It became evident that Hemi's obsession had taken a dark and deadly turn. As investigators assembled the case, one key question remained: was he acting alone? Did Andrea manipulate Hemi into murdering her husband? Did she feed his delusions, fuel his obsession, and make him believe that her husband Rusty was the only obstacle keeping them apart? Or was she an innocent bystander caught up in the chaos of a man spiraling out of control? Andrea had claimed she didn't know Rusty had been shot until she arrived at the hospital, around 11 a.m., but phone records showed she had called Rusty's father at 9:36 a.m., less than 30 minutes after the shooting, and told him that Rusty had been shot. How did she know no one had told her? Police hadn't released that information yet. Her own testimony contradicted what she had told Rusty's family. Rusty's father would later testify in court, visibly emotional, confirming that Andrea had called and said that Rusty had been shot and that she was heading to Dunwoody Prep to find out what had happened. If Andrea didn't know, why would she say that? Prosecutors were beginning to suspect that Andrea wasn't just a grieving widow. Maybe she knew more than she let on. Maybe she hadn't pulled the trigger. But had she played a part? As Hemi sat in jail awaiting trial, investigators uncovered more receipts, rental records, gun purchases. By January 2011, Hemi was charged with murder. But the question hanging over the case was no longer just about who pulled the trigger. The real question was who else knew. More than a year after the murder of Rusty Snyderman, the case finally arrived in a courtroom. The DeKalb County Courthouse was packed. Reporters, legal observers, family members all watched as the man accused of gunning down a young father at a daycare center stood trial. Hemi had confessed to pulling the trigger. Now, he wasn't fighting to prove he was innocent. He was fighting to prove he was insane. At the center of the defense strategy was one claim: Hemi wasn't in his right mind when he murdered Rusty. He was mentally ill, lost in delusions, manipulated by voices, and incapable of knowing right from wrong. His lawyers entered a plea of not guilty due to insanity. The prosecution, however, contended the opposite. He was sane, calculated, and dangerously obsessed. This was not a breakdown. It was a betrayal fueled by infatuation and selfish desire. During opening statements, the courtroom heard a bizarre explanation that completely changed the way the trial was perceived. Hemi's lawyers said he had been hearing voices for weeks before the murder. One deep, masculine voice, like Barry White's, repeatedly encouraged him to kill himself. Meanwhile, another soft, gentle voice, like Olivia Newton-John, instructed him to kill Rusty, saying that Rusty was a danger to his children. Hemi claimed that he truly believed he was protecting the Rusty's children. The story was so bizarre that it seemed beyond belief. The jury was silent, and even seasoned reporters could not hide their disbelief. A psychiatrist testified that Hemi suffered from bipolar disorder with psychotic features and was experiencing a manic, delusional episode when he committed the crime. Another expert supported this diagnosis, stating that Hemi's grip on reality had been unraveling for months, but the prosecution rejected this narrative entirely. To them, the voices were a fabrication, a calculated act. They didn't see a man spiraling out of control. They saw someone meticulously planning a murder, renting a car under a false identity, donning a disguise, driving across town, waiting, shooting, leaving. All of it pointed to premeditation. The prosecution also highlighted how Hemi deceived those around him. To them, this wasn't about mental illness. It was about jealousy, rejection, and unfulfilled desire. They argued that the true motivation behind the murder wasn't insanity. It was Andrea. The tension in the courtroom peaked when Andrea took the stand. She appeared different from before, polished and distant. Some described her as composed, while others saw arrogance in her demeanor. Andrea was asked directly if she had ever been romantically involved with Hemi, and she replied that she had not. The prosecution was prepared for this response. They presented a series of emails filled with emotionally charged messages. In one, Hemi pleaded with her to marry him. Others described shared moments, stargazing, waking up together in Denver, and walking hand in hand in Edinburgh. Andrea denied any romantic involvement, claiming that he had been infatuated, that she had tried to handle it, and that she had never encouraged it. Her testimony, however, only raised more questions. She admitted to letting Hemi into her hotel room during work trips, but maintained it was always innocent. She also admitted she never told her husband, Rusty, about Hemi's advances. Even after realizing Hemi had feelings for her, she continued to travel with him, sit beside him on flights, and take his late-night calls. The boundary between professional and personal was hopelessly blurred. When questioned about why she hadn't disclosed the nature of her relationship with Hemi to the police, Andrea said she didn't think it was relevant. But that explanation didn't sit well, neither with the prosecution nor the jury. Suspicion deepened when Rusty's father testified that Andrea had called him less than 30 minutes after the shooting and said Rusty had been shot, a fact that hadn't yet been made public. Andrea had previously claimed she didn't know about the shooting until she arrived at the hospital. Her timeline didn't add up. The prosecution seized on this inconsistency. If Andrea knew about the shooting before anyone told her, how did she know? Did Hemi warn her in advance? Did she already know it was going to happen? These questions hung heavily in the courtroom, unsettling the jury. The murder case with signs of insanity initially seemed simple, but then it became much more complicated and confusing. The defense reminded the jury that this trial was not about Andrea. Hemi was the one facing a life sentence. They repeatedly focused on Hemi's troubled past, including an abusive father and years of emotional instability. The defense argued that while Andrea may have been emotionally careless, it was Hemi who ultimately lost control. The prosecution, however, was relentless. In their closing arguments, they portrayed Hemi not as psychotic, but as calculated. They ridiculed the suggestion that voices compelled Hemi to act, mocking the idea that hearing songs by Barry White and Olivia Newton-John could justify a premeditated murder. The jury swiftly arrived at a verdict after thoroughly reviewing the evidence and testimony. Hemi Newman was declared guilty but mentally ill. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole, guaranteeing he would remain incarcerated for the rest of his life. Andrea called the verdict a relief and described her late husband, Rusty, as an amazing man. Yet the trial had permanently altered how the public viewed her. The inconsistent testimony, coupled with her behavior and relationship with Hemi, her husband's killer, created a lingering suspicion that she could not shake. Justice came with complications. Hemi Newman would spend the rest of his life in prison, held responsible for killing Rusty Snyderman while grappling with mental illness. For Rusty's family, the verdict brought some sense of closure, but true peace remained elusive. Andrea was never charged with murder. Although she was initially charged, prosecutors later dropped the most serious charges because there was not enough evidence to clearly and convincingly prove her involvement. Instead, she was convicted of perjury and obstruction for lying under oath and misleading investigators. She served time in prison, but not for her husband's death. The case left a lasting impact. A father was killed in cold blood outside his child's daycare. His murderer was consumed by an obsession with another man's wife, and Andrea, at the heart of it all, faced a lifetime of skepticism in the court of public opinion. Jeffrey Marsalis, born in the 1970s and raised in Idaho, grew up in a state better known for its scenic mountains and ski resorts than national scandals. While not especially prominent, the Marsalis family was well regarded in the local community, appearing to be an average, stable, upper-middle-class household, quiet, tidy, and seemingly ordinary. From a young age, Jeffrey was seen as intelligent, composed, and self-assured. Teachers described him as clever, sometimes too clever, with a keen sense of observation that could inspire either admiration or suspicion. He wasn't outspoken, but he thrived on being persuasive, often taking on the role of a subtle performer. As a teenager, Jeffrey was athletic, clean-cut, and active in school organizations. He avoided trouble, maintained a clean criminal record, and always presented himself as polite to adults. His outward appearance and demeanor painted a picture of an ambitious young man, underestimated by some but clearly driven. After high school, Jeffrey pursued higher education and enrolled in nursing school. He chose a career in healthcare, a field grounded in trust and compassion, traits he effectively portrayed. He never completed an advanced degree, though his partial education helped him speak confidently about healthcare, impressing those less familiar with the field. In the early 2000s, Jeffrey moved to Philadelphia, a city full of educational institutions and professional opportunities. He rented a small apartment and began presenting himself as Dr. Jeff, weaving lies and truths together so seamlessly it was hard for others to discern reality. He constructed elaborate personas, portraying himself as a doctor, Navy officer, CIA agent, trauma surgeon, and even astronaut, tailoring his identity to suit his audience. His act was convincing, complete with props like stethoscopes, military gear, badges, NASA memorabilia, and forged documents, all reinforcing his false narratives. Jeffrey used online dating platforms like Match.com to extend his web of deception. His polished profile, featuring sharp photos and a veneer of sophistication, appealed to women seeking a successful, educated, and committed partner. He played the role flawlessly, presenting himself as the ideal match. To acquaintances, Jeffrey was a charismatic enigma. He could engage in discussions on a broad range of topics, from foreign policy to anatomy, military strategy, or romance, adjusting his charm based on his audience. He didn't come across as threatening, but rather as polished and intriguing. While he kept a low profile in public, he thrived in one-on-one interactions, where he dominated conversations and carefully controlled the narrative. Romantically, he had little trouble attracting partners. He claimed to be a doctor working at 3 of Philadelphia's top hospitals, a veteran of classified overseas missions, and a high-level intelligence operative with powerful connections in Washington. Although his stories were extravagant, his calm confidence often made people believe him. When questioned, he always had convincing explanations. Jeffrey told women he was restricted from sharing certain details due to national security concerns. His apartment featured just enough theatrics to make his stories believable: a fingerprint scanner on his computer, a CIA-themed screensaver, and files marked with terms like top secret or eyes only. To those meeting him for the first time, the combination of real-world elements and fantasy seemed plausible. However, beneath the facade, there were inconsistencies. He frequently changed jobs, showed little commitment to any single profession, and never finished his advanced education. His work history was inconsistent, but it didn't immediately raise suspicion. Jeffrey moved fluidly between social circles, blending in well enough to avoid scrutiny while standing out just enough to capture attention. When people met Jeffrey casually, they rarely noticed any discrepancies in his character. He appeared confident, successful, and composed, someone worth knowing. Women who went on dates with him often left impressed, feeling special and chosen. Jeffrey had a knack for quickly understanding people, figuring out what they wanted to hear, and delivering it. It wasn't just simple charm. It was a calculated strategy. Yet, behind his polished image, Jeffrey had no close friends and confided in no one. He was constantly on the move, reshaping his identity to fit the moment. Whether in Philadelphia or Idaho, the story was always the same: Dr. Jeff, a man with purpose, connections, and nothing that seemed worth questioning. But the truth was starkly different. Jeffrey was none of the things he claimed to be. He had no medical license, no military experience, and no credentials to support the image he meticulously curated. For years, no one saw through his act. He walked through life projecting the appearance of someone with it all together. Jeffrey controlled the narrative about himself. When women met him online, typically through Match.com, they believed him. He was polished, articulate, and educated, and low-key charming in a way that inspired trust. He didn't appear arrogant or controlling. On the contrary, he seemed caring, empathetic, and safe. But things were not as they seemed, and troubling patterns began to surface. Women who interacted with Jeffrey shared eerily similar stories. At first, he would send thoughtful messages and smoothly suggest meeting for drinks. Their first date often involved alcohol, wine, cocktails, or beer. He'd make engaging conversation, ask questions, and come across as a busy man truly invested in getting to know them. Each woman left feeling special, as though they'd been given a glimpse into his exciting, secretive life. The evening often ended with an invitation to his place or for just one more drink. Then everything went silent. All emotions stopped. Time passed, leaving behind an uneasy feeling. Many women reported waking up in an unfamiliar bed, naked, disoriented, and physically unwell. Sometimes Jeffrey was beside them. Other times, they were alone. Their clothing would be misarranged, their bodies would ache, and they'd have no memory of consenting, or even of what had happened. When they confronted him, he denied anything unusual. He would feign surprise or dismiss their concerns, saying that they had had too much to drink or that they had really been into it, and told them not to make it a big deal. Many people felt self-conscious, began to doubt themselves, tried to explain the situation, and hesitated to call the police. After all, Jeffrey was known as Dr. Jeff, a Navy veteran and trauma specialist. Who would believe otherwise about him? That all changed in 2005 when a young woman from Idaho, known as Jody, decided to speak up. Jody met Jeffrey while working at the Sun Valley Resort in Idaho. where he had relocated after initial allegations began to emerge in Philadelphia. At the resort, he worked as a security guard, not a doctor, but his lies continued. He claimed to be involved in military intelligence and hinted at a life filled with experiences most people couldn't imagine. Jody has no romantic interest in Jeffrey because she is openly gay. However, she accepts his invitation to have a drink as a friend because she believes she can trust him. That night, something went horribly wrong. After Jody left her beer unattended and later drank from it, she suddenly felt dizzy and disoriented. She tried to leave, but Jeffrey insisted on walking her home. She eventually passed out. The next morning, she woke up naked in an unfamiliar room, vomiting and feeling physically violated. Her memories were fragmented, but her instincts told her something terrible had happened. Meanwhile, Jeffrey acted as though nothing was wrong, calling her his little gay buddy and walking her back to her dorm. But Jody refused to ignore her intuition. She went to the hospital, contacted the police, and submitted to an abuse kit exam immediately. Unlike the women in Philadelphia, Jody had physical evidence, DNA and medical documentation that confirmed her story. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Special Victims Unit had already begun piecing together complaints against Jeffrey. Quiet investigations had started after one woman came forward months earlier. The more investigators dug, the more names emerged. Women from Match.com, as well as those he met socially, began to recount similar experiences. Over time, 21 women stepped forward, each with chillingly consistent accounts of how Jeffrey had deceived and harmed them. Detective Charlie Conway recalled the moment the pattern became evident. He said that those weren't isolated misunderstandings and that it was a clear and deliberate scheme. Evidence mounted when investigators found a spreadsheet on Jeffrey's computer titled Yearly Calendar of Women. It listed names, dates, places, and cryptic notes. A chilling record prosecutors believed documented his victims. In his Philadelphia apartment, police uncovered disturbing items: a bulletproof vest, a police baton, fake hospital IDs, medical equipment, and forged or stolen military and government documents, including Navy insignias and fake CIA credentials. Among his belongings were a fingerprint scanner and software imitating a classified government system. A framed NASA astronaut photo added to the collection of identities Jeffrey used to deceive. Victims' stories followed a similar pattern. They described going on dates that ended in blackouts, waking up with no memory of what happened. Many felt trapped in shame, confusion, and disorientation. Shockingly, some continued seeing him, caught in cycles of manipulation and trauma. Jeffrey used not just drugs, but psychological control, breaking down their ability to consent. Prosecutors have faced significant challenges. Many victims come forward months or even years after the attack, leaving behind little physical evidence, such as banned substance test results, abuse kits, or witnesses. Cases often rely heavily on victim testimony. While this testimony is reliable, it is often insufficient to meet the high standard of proof in criminal cases. The case took a turn in 2006. Jeffrey was arrested in Sun Valley, Idaho, after a woman named Jody reported him immediately. Her swift action, coupled with medical evidence from an abuse kit and visible injuries, strengthened the case against him. Authorities in Idaho collaborated with Philadelphia investigators, who were building their own case based on a pattern of accusations. When confronted, Jeffrey remained calm, denying all allegations. His defense attempted to cast him as a harmless ladies' man who was being targeted by regretful women. Prosecutors, however, focused on exposing his systematic deceit. In addition to charges of abuse and assault, Jeffrey also faced allegations of impersonating public officials, committing identity fraud, and obstructing justice. By masquerading as a doctor, soldier, or spy, he not only lured victims, but also used these personas to dominate and silence them. Meanwhile, victims began connecting with one another, forming a support network to share stories and timelines. Many said it was the first time they felt heard and validated. As Jeffrey awaited trial, the scale of his crimes became clearer. Over the years, he had meticulously planned his actions, refining his methods and keeping detailed records to avoid detection. Each victim thought she was alone, unaware of the full scope of his predation. By spring 2007, Jeffrey stood trial in a Philadelphia courtroom in one of the city's most disturbing serial abuse cases. Once regarded as a charismatic and educated professional, he is now facing charges, including abuse, from 7 separate victims. Despite this, the case posed challenges. Prosecutors had no physical evidence from the Philadelphia victims, no toxicology reports, no abuse kits, and no witnesses. What they did have were consistent, compelling testimonies from women who had never met each other, but shared the same harrowing stories. They described Jeffrey's charm, his offers of drinks, the unexplained blackouts, and waking up confused, violated, and ashamed. Assistant District Attorney Joe McGettigan built the case around this consistency, along with the damning spreadsheet found on Jeffrey's laptop. The yearly calendar of women provided names, dates, and chilling notes that painted a picture of systematic abuse. Prosecutors also introduced evidence of Jeffrey's fake identities, including a CIA badge, hospital IDs, and military props, used to manipulate and exploit his victims, one by one. The women testified. Many wept. Others trembled as they recounted their trauma. They spoke about sickness, helplessness, self-blame, and waking up disoriented with their clothes in disarray. Some admitted staying in touch with him afterward, explaining how psychological manipulation left them unable to confront their abuse. This emotional confusion became a focal point of the defense's argument. Defense attorney James Funt argued that all the encounters were consensual, claiming the accusers felt regret, not trauma. He highlighted the absence of timely police reports and pointed out inconsistencies in their recollections. The defense also noted the lack of medical evidence, arguing that in a case based solely on memories, doubt was unavoidable. Jeffrey sat silently in the courtroom, rarely showing emotion and occasionally smiling. He portrayed himself as a victim of a vendetta, targeted for his persona rather than his actions. His defense team insisted he never claimed to be a CIA agent or a doctor, arguing these were misunderstandings or exaggerations created by the women themselves. In March 2007, the verdict was announced. Jeffrey was acquitted of all charges except 2, for which he was found guilty of abuse. His acquittal on the most serious charges shocked many, particularly the women who had risked everything to testify. While the partial conviction was a legal victory, it felt emotionally hollow. Jeffrey was released on bail. However, his legal troubles were far from over. In Idaho, Jeffrey faced a separate, much stronger case, built on physical evidence. In 2009, he was tried in Blaine County for the abuse of Jody, a 21-year-old woman who had immediately sought medical help and cooperated fully with law enforcement. This time, the prosecution had what was missing in Philadelphia: an abuse kit, DNA evidence, documented injuries, and a clear timeline. They presented expert witnesses and highlighted the consistency between Jody's account and stories told by women from the previous case. Jeffrey's history, detailed in his spreadsheet and patterns of behavior, was laid bare. Jody testified with precision, recounting the night she drank with Jeffrey, how she detected something granular in her beer, the disorientation that followed, and the terror of waking up naked beside him. Her testimony was clear, her fear undeniable. The defense once again argued that the encounter was consensual and claimed Jody had misinterpreted the situation. But the jury rejected their narrative. In 2009, Jeffrey was convicted of abuse in Idaho and sentenced to life in prison. For the first time, the justice system handed down a punishment that matched the severity of Jeffrey's crimes. Crimes many believed he had been committing for years. The courtroom in Idaho resounded with relief, a stark contrast to the frustration felt in Philadelphia 2 years earlier. Jeffrey's carefully constructed double life had crumbled. The man who once boasted about being a doctor, Navy SEAL, CIA operative, and even an astronaut, was now just another inmate. For the women who testified against him, the legal outcomes brought both vindication and lingering pain. In Philadelphia, his acquittal on the most serious charges devastated many. 21 women shared their stories, but their voices were not reflected in the final verdict. In Idaho, however, the guilty verdict and life sentence represented a long-awaited moment of accountability. For Jody, the survivor whose immediate actions and forensic evidence proved pivotal, it was more than a legal triumph, it was deeply personal. Her courage to speak out promptly and consistently made all the difference. Her case demonstrated what is possible when survivors are believed, supported, and protected by the justice system. The Jeffrey case stands as a chilling example of how image, privilege, and manipulation can allow someone to avoid accountability for years. He had no criminal record, dressed impeccably, and spoke with professionalism and authority. In a justice system often plagued by doubt and contradiction, these traits worked in his favor until they didn't. The case also reignited debates on how the legal system deals with dating abuse, especially when physical evidence is lacking. Prosecutors and victims' advocates highlighted the narrow definitions of proof and the challenges of pursuing cases where the weapon isn't a knife, but a drink. In court, women not only had to explain what happened to them, but were also scrutinized for how they reacted, how quickly they reported the crime, and whether their accounts were perfect enough to be believed. The case of Jeffrey Marsalis serves as a warning about the illusion of safety, how someone can be well-dressed, well-spoken, and still pose a threat. It underscores the cost of silence and the immense bravery required to come forward. Above all, it reminds us that predators don't always appear monstrous. Sometimes, they look like the man you met online, the one with the warm smile, whose story seemed just believable enough. Jeffrey's deception was widespread, but in the end, it wasn't enough to protect him. Caitlin Hunt was born on August 14, 1994 in Sebastian, Florida, a small, peaceful coastal town in Indian River County. Her family was well known locally, not for wealth or social influence, but because they were active members of the community, often seen at school events, youth sports activities, and local businesses. Caitlin, affectionately known as Kate, grew up in a family that valued self-expression, individuality, and loyalty. Caitlin's family is middle class, characterized by a tradition of hard work and emotional openness. Her father, Stephen, worked in trades and maintenance, while her mother, Kelly, owned a salon and had a strong, protective nature. Caitlin has an older sister, and the relationship between the two is both close and deep, like best friends, and tinged with the usual sibling rivalry. Their family life is always busy and sometimes quite lively, with cozy meals and heartfelt moments, all of which have nurtured and shaped Caitlin into an honest, strong, and opinionated person from a young age. Caitlin stood out for her vibrant personality, She was energetic, outgoing, and unafraid to express her thoughts. Teachers described her as confident, curious, and assertive, often questioning things instead of blindly agreeing. She had a strong sense of fairness and often stood up for kids who were excluded or bullied. On the playground, she naturally took the lead, and in the classroom, while she sometimes got in trouble for talking too much, it was never for being disrespectful. In middle school, Caitlin's character developed further. She became more self-aware, driven, and sensitive to social dynamics. Her friend group was diverse, including athletes, artists, musicians, and those who didn't fit into specific categories. Caitlin gravitated toward people who were unique and made it a point to ensure they felt accepted. As she explored her own identity, she was known for being open and emotionally available, someone her friends could confide in without hesitation. When it came to her own story, Caitlin stayed honest and true to herself. By high school, Caitlin had truly come into her own. At Sebastian River High School, she was a familiar and well-liked presence. She cheered on the school's teams as a cheerleader, played varsity basketball, participated in pep rallies, joined the choir, and kept up with a full academic schedule. Outside of school, Caitlin worked at a smoothie shop and spent her free time enjoying music, going to the beach, and hanging out with her close-knit group of friends. She was active on social media, but her posts reflected her personality, focused on humor, friendship, and the joys of everyday teenage life in Florida. She wasn't flashy or attention-seeking. Instead, she valued genuine relationships and kept her circle tight. At home, Caitlin held on to her family's values. Her parents, though firm in some ways, gave her the space she needed to grow and develop her own ideals. The Hunt family was outspoken about their beliefs, whether this meant supporting their daughter's dreams, guarding their privacy, or standing up to criticism. Caitlin inherited this strength. She was resilient, uninterested in small talk or blending in, and unapologetically herself. Caitlin's openness about her sexuality was just another facet of who she was. She didn't treat it as a statement or a cause. It was simply part of her life. She dated openly during high school and never felt the need to hide her feelings. There were no big announcements or dramatic declarations, just a quiet, natural acceptance of her identity. Her classmates, teachers, and family were all aware, and it didn't faze her. For her, it was simply the truth. By her senior year in 2012 to 2013, Caitlin was preparing to graduate and plan her future beyond Sebastian River High School. She was interested in pursuing a career in healthcare, possibly in nursing or sports medicine, and was actively exploring college options. Caitlin had solid grades, was involved in extracurricular activities, and had stable relationships with those around her. She was in a position many teenagers aspire to. Her parents trusted her. She was respected at school, and she felt hopeful about the future. To others, Caitlin seemed like a teenager with a promising path ahead, a mix of discipline and independence, passion and playfulness. Like many young people, she was sometimes impulsive and didn't always think about how her actions might be perceived. However, she was also thoughtful and determined. Her high school life was similar to that of many others, busy, emotional, filled with milestones and uncertainties. Caitlin wasn't perfect, nor did she claim to be. She was simply a real 18 years old navigating the transition between adolescence and adulthood. What no one could have predicted was how quickly her life would change and how far-reaching the consequences of one relationship would become. In early 2013, Caitlin, a senior at Sebastian River High School, was finishing up her final months of high school. She was active in sports, participated in choir, and preparing to graduate, beneath the surface of her seemingly routine teenage life. However, a personal relationship had developed that would soon lead to a legal and public controversy. Caitlin had entered into a relationship with a 14-year-old freshman girl at her school, who was in her first year of high school. Their connection reportedly began through mutual friends and shared activities, and evolved from friendship into a more intimate relationship. To Caitlin and those close to her, the relationship appeared to be consensual, affectionate, and typical of young people exploring romance and identity. However, the law in Florida viewed it differently. Florida law is clear regarding age and consent. The legal age of consent in the state is 16. Any intimate activity involving an adult, someone 18 or older, and someone under 16 is classified as a felony, regardless of perceived consent or emotional ties. Caitlin had just turned 18 just months before the relationship turned physical, while her girlfriend was still legally a minor. The situation came to light when the younger girl's parents discovered social media exchanges and messages on their daughter's phone. They confronted their daughter, who confirmed the nature of the relationship, including its emotional and physical aspects. Alarmed by the age difference and concerned about their daughter's well-being, the parents took action. They informed the school and later filed a formal complaint with the Indian River County Sheriff's Office. As a result, law enforcement launched an investigation. Detectives interviewed the younger student and collected digital evidence, including thousands of text messages, Facebook chats, call logs, and other communications between the two young women. According to police reports, the younger girl admitted the relationship had included physical contact on at least 2 occasions, once in a school restroom and once in a car parked on school grounds. These details were critical to the investigation, as they established a timeline and location falling under state criminal law. Caitlin was contacted by authorities and questioned. She admitted to the relationship and confirmed several details about what had occurred. In her view, the relationship had been consensual and free of abuse or exploitation. She believed it was based on mutual feelings rather than manipulation or coercion. However, her own statements and the digital evidence gathered were used to support charges against her. On February 16, 2013, Caitlin was arrested at her home and charged with 2 felony counts child abuse between the ages of 12 and 16. The arrest shocked Caitlin's community and devastated her family, who saw the relationship as a consensual teenage romance rather than a criminal act. The charges could result in up to 15 years in prison and mandatory registration as a predator. Caitlin's parents immediately protested the charges, arguing that the case was not just about age, but also about discrimination. They believe Caitlin's gender played a significant role in the prosecution, and that if she had been male in a relationship with a younger woman, the case may have been handled differently or dismissed. They pointed to Florida's Romeo and Juliet law, which offers legal relief for close-in-age relationships, and highlighted other similar cases where leniency had been granted. The case quickly gained attention beyond Indian River County. Drawing national media coverage, Caitlin's family began a campaign under the hashtag #FreeKate, advocating for the charges against her to be dropped or reduced. Their online petition quickly garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Supporters nationwide, including civil rights activists, attorneys, and public figures, joined the conversation, arguing that the prosecution represented a miscarriage of justice. As public debate intensified, the legal process continued. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence and proposed a plea deal to Caitlin, in exchange for pleading guilty or no contest to lesser charges. She would avoid prison time and offender status for abuse, but instead serve house arrest and probation. A key condition of the deal required Caitlin to cease all contact with the victim in order to protect the younger girl and maintain the integrity of the case. Initially, Caitlin declined the plea deal. Her legal team hoped media pressure would lead the state attorney's office to reconsider or drop the charges, arguing that the relationship was a case of misguided but mutual teenage behavior, not a predatory felony act. However, in May 2013, the case took a dramatic turn. Prosecutors uncovered new evidence indicating Caitlin had violated the no-contact order. On the victim's confiscated iPod, authorities found over 20,000 text messages, audio files, and images. Many messages were emotional, romantic, and sometimes abusive. They included criticisms of the girl's parents, expressions of love and loyalty, and discussions of the investigation. Additionally, some messages suggested plans for secret meetings and efforts to communicate covertly through third parties, further complicating the situation. Jailhouse phone recordings revealed Caitlin discussing strategies to maintain contact with the girl despite the court order. In these conversations, Caitlin expressed frustration and heartbreak, but also defied the restrictions explicitly placed on her. With this new evidence, the prosecution withdrew the initial plea deal and filed additional charges, including transmission of materials harmful to a minor. These charges significantly increased Caitlin's legal jeopardy, undermining the defense's argument that her actions were a youthful mistake. Caitlin was arrested again. Her bail amount was increased, and the direction of the case underwent a significant change. It now appeared to prosecutors as a clear situation of someone intentionally violating court orders and laws, rather than a murky legal matter. Public opinion began to diverge. Many of those who initially supported the Free Kate movement remained loyal, but others expressed frustration with Caitlin's decisions after her arrest. The focus shifted from the nature of the relationship to Caitlin's defiance of legal boundaries and the court's authority. As the case drew to a close, the evidence included electronic communications, statements from both parties, and proof of continued contact after the initial arrest. What had started as an emotional and polarizing debate over age, intent, and relationships became a legal battle centered on compliance with the law. Caitlin's future, once full of promise with graduation and college prospects, now hung in limbo. A teenage romance had escalated into a high-stakes criminal case, fueled by emotion, public pressure, and cultural debates about justice. By late 2013, the case of the state of Florida versus Caitlin Hunt had grown far beyond the high school hallways into the national spotlight of the criminal justice system. The case attracted attention with various types of evidence. The charges continued to mount, and the courtroom became the deciding venue for a highly controversial case. Despite intense media attention and appeals for leniency, the legal process remained focused on the facts: the victim's age, the documented abusive relationship, and the thousands of messages proving that Caitlin had violated the no-contact order. To avoid a trial, which would force the minor to testify, introduce emotional evidence, and create further trauma for both families, both sides worked toward a plea agreement. A trial posed great risks for Caitlin. A conviction on all charges, including transmission of harmful materials, could result in up to 15 years in prison and mandatory abuse offender registration. On November 15, 2013, Caitlin Hunt appeared in court and accepted a revised plea agreement. She pleaded no contest to reduced charges, which included 2 counts of misdemeanor battery and 2 felonies related to violating the no-contact order. The plea deal spared her from prison time and lifetime registration as an abuse offender. Instead, her sentence consisted of 4 months in county jail, 2 years of house arrest with electronic monitoring, and another year of probation. She was also required to attend counseling, faced restrictions on internet and social media use, and remained under a strict no-contact order with the victim. The courtroom atmosphere was calm but serious. Dressed in plain clothes, Caitlin stood beside her attorney as the judge reviewed the plea terms. She answered only procedural questions with short, respectful replies. There were no dramatic statements or efforts to shift the narrative. The proceedings were formal and restrained, reinforcing that the case was being handled strictly within the bounds of the law. The prosecution briefly explained their reasoning for the agreement, noting the case's national attention, but emphasizing that the plea aligned with state sentencing guidelines, particularly for first-time offenders who accepted responsibility. They also stressed the importance of limiting further public attention on the victim. The defense expressed relief over the resolution, portraying Caitlin as a young woman who had acted emotionally, but not maliciously. They argued that she was neither a predator nor a continued threat to society, framing the case as a youthful mistake that had been amplified by legal technicalities and public scrutiny. The judge approved the plea agreement, confirming Caitlin had waived her right to trial and accepted the consequences of her actions. The sentence was finalized, and Caitlin was sent to the Indian River County Jail to begin her term, followed by the conditions of her release. No reporters were allowed in the courtroom, but news of the plea agreement quickly spread. For some, the sentence felt like a middle ground, a way to resolve a difficult situation without devastating Caitlin's future. For others, it underscored the seriousness of crossing legal boundaries, regardless of the circumstances. The proceedings concluded without drama. The defense did not challenge the central facts. The prosecution did not pursue the harshest penalties, and the court balanced the law, the evidence, and human considerations to reach its decision. When Caitlin began her jail term, the legal case officially came to a close. However, the ripple effects of the case continued. For her, the victim, their families, and the broader community that had followed every development. For Caitlin, the plea deal provided an opportunity to avoid prison and a lifetime on the abuse offender registry. But the impact of the case continued to affect her into adulthood. Her name remained linked to the case through online records and background checks. After serving her sentence and completing probation, she began the challenging process of moving forward, though her life remained shaped by a decision made at 18. What had seemed like a relationship rooted in young love resulted in lasting legal and personal consequences. The court orders prohibited her from contacting the victim, and any breach of these restrictions could bring further penalties. Her social media activity was monitored, and her career prospects and public reputation were permanently affected by her conviction. For the younger teen involved, whose identity was legally protected, the effects were largely private but no less profound. Although national attention surrounded the case, her story remained confidential. She avoided the public eye but endured the emotional toll. Her high school years were overshadowed by a case that thrust her life into a national spotlight, leaving her tethered to an event that had spiraled out of her control. The case sparked intense debate in American media and legal circles. Caitlin's supporters viewed it as an example of how rigid laws could unfairly criminalize typical teenage behavior. Critics, however, emphasized that the issue was not about sexual orientation or public opinion. It was about safeguarding minors under the law. The division in public opinion highlighted a larger cultural question. How should the legal system handle relationships between teens with age differences? Where should compassion end and accountability begin? Florida's Romeo and Juliet laws, designed to offer leniency in certain cases, did not apply here because of the age gap and timing. However, the national conversation that ensued prompted lawmakers, educators, and parents to reconsider how they approach topics like boundaries, consent, and responsibility with young people. It serves as a reminder that a personal relationship, when subjected to legal scrutiny, can become a pivotal moment not just for those involved, but for how society addresses such issues. Sometimes the greatest danger comes from the person you think you know, a face you recognize, a voice you trust, someone who's been inside your home, someone you've hired, someone you've helped. It's September 8th, 2010, and for one Kansas woman, an ordinary morning is about to become a nightmare that will change her life forever. Marty Hill had no reason to be afraid that morning. At just 97 pounds, she was a powerhouse at work, known for her reliability and dedication. Her co-workers called her dynamite in a small package. She was the type of person who always showed up, always got things done, always made everything around her better. Which is exactly why, when she didn't show up for the 10 o'clock production meeting at her apparel company, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The tight-knit group at her workplace had never seen Marty miss a meeting without explanation. She was dependable to a fault. When text messages went unanswered and phone calls went straight to voicemail, concern quickly turned to fear. By 11:30 that morning, a co-worker made the decision to drive to Marty's house. What they found there would launch an investigation that would reveal just how dangerous it can be to trust the wrong person. Marty's car sat in the driveway. Her front door was closed but unlocked. Her purse sat undisturbed on the kitchen table. But Marty was nowhere to be found upstairs. It wasn't until police arrived and ventured into the basement that they discovered the horrifying truth. At the bottom of those basement stairs lay a woman covered head to toe in blood, breathing but barely alive. The amount of blood surrounding her on the floor told a story of unimaginable violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random break-in. This was something far more personal and infinitely more terrifying. The officer who found her knelt beside the barely conscious woman and asked the question that would drive the entire investigation. Who did this to you? Who did this in those critical moments? As Marty fought for her life, the race was on to find her attacker before they could strike again. When paramedics rushed Marty to the hospital, doctors were stunned by the extent of her injuries. The major veins, skin, and muscle of her left neck had been completely severed. The major artery had multiple scrapes on it, missing complete severance by mere millimeters. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in bruises that spoke to a sustained and vicious beating. The head trauma alone was life-threatening. For the next hour and a half, surgeons worked meticulously to piece together the damage, cleaning and repairing injuries that should have killed her. Even then, doctors remained gravely concerned about brain swelling and the possibility that Marty might not survive the next 24 to 72 hours. Her family arrived at the hospital to find a woman they barely recognized. Marty's eyes were swollen completely shut. Her head was 3 times its normal size. Her teenage daughter later described seeing only her mother's hands and knowing those were the only parts she could still identify. The emotional trauma of seeing their loved one in this condition was almost unbearable. But even as Marty fought for her life in the ICU, investigators were working around the clock to find her attacker. With no signs of sexual assault and no theft from the home, the motive remained a complete mystery. Marty's mother provided crucial information about her daughter's quiet lifestyle. She was a workaholic who rarely left the house except for work. She wasn't dating anyone and kept to herself. The investigation initially focused on Marty's ex-husband, Steve Hill. In cases like this, law enforcement always looks first at those closest to the victim. But Steve was cooperative, providing a detailed account of his activities that day and expressing genuine concern for Marty's well-being. He wanted to find her attacker just as desperately as everyone else did. With Steve cleared as a suspect, investigators found themselves with very limited leads. That's when Marty's mother mentioned B&J Construction, a company that had recently done work on both her home and Marty's. The supervisor, a man named Brian, had seemed like a nice guy, a hard worker, and a family man. Marty's mother had even recommended him based on the quality work he'd done at her house. Brian Pennington was 26 years old and lived in Leeton, Missouri, about an hour and a half from Kansas City. When detectives arrived at his secluded dark house around 9 p.m., they found him polite and cooperative. But something wasn't right. Brian had several fresh scratches on the left side of his face that he claimed came from his dog jumping on him the day before. To the trained eyes of experienced investigators, those scratches didn't look consistent with what a dog would do. Brian kept emphasizing his financial difficulties, claiming there was no way he could have driven to Kansas City because he didn't have money for gas. His young wife, Jessica, backed up his alibi, insisting he'd been home with her the entire time. But when detectives asked to search Brian's clothing for any bloodstains, he readily agreed. What they found in a hamper in the corner of the bathroom would change everything. A pair of jeans near the bottom was covered in red stains, concentrated around the knees and lower portions of the legs. Brian claimed the stains weren't blood, but when detectives rushed the jeans to the crime lab that same night, they tested positive for human blood within 30 minutes. The question now was whose blood it was, and investigators would have to wait several more days for DNA results. The cooperation Brian showed in allowing the search of his home surprised investigators. Most guilty parties don't willingly hand over evidence that could convict them. But perhaps Brian thought the investigation wouldn't go any further, that his word and his wife's alibi would be enough to clear him. Meanwhile, Marty remained in critical condition, unable to communicate with investigators. Doctors were cautiously optimistic, but her recovery was far from certain. The attack had been so brutal, so sustained, that it seemed impossible anyone could survive it. Yet somehow, Marty was fighting back. On the third day after the attack, everything changed. Marty suddenly began to speak, and with her words came the flood of memories from that terrible morning. There was no confusion, no uncertainty in her voice. She knew exactly who had attacked her and why she had opened her door to him that early morning. The man she named would shock everyone who knew him as a trusted contractor, a family man, someone who had been welcomed into homes throughout the community. But appearances, as this case would prove, can be fatally deceiving. As the DNA results came back, confirming that the blood on Brian Pennington's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something much darker, and the question that haunted everyone involved was simple: why? Brian Pennington had been in Marty's home before. He'd done work there, earned her trust, been paid for his services. When he knocked on her door that September morning, she had no reason to fear him. She recognized his face, knew his voice, remembered the quality of his work. It was this familiarity that made him so dangerous. According to Marty's recollection, Brian mentioned something about the basement, something he thought she should know about from his previous work there. It seemed reasonable enough. Contractors often remembered details about jobs, noticed things that needed attention. So when he suggested they go downstairs to look at something, Marty led the way. She was 2 steps from the bottom when everything changed. Without warning, without explanation, Brian grabbed her throat with a grip so tight and strong that her voice began to fade. She kept asking what he was doing, but he remained silent. The man who had made pleasant conversation during his work visits now showed no emotion, offered no explanation for the violence he was inflicting. As her voice grew weaker and softer, Marty realized she couldn't speak at all. Then darkness took over, and she lost consciousness. What happened next would be reconstructed by forensic evidence and medical testimony, painting a picture of violence so extreme it defied comprehension. The investigation revealed that after strangling Marty into unconsciousness, Brian didn't stop there. Evidence suggested he then beat her head repeatedly against the concrete basement floor, causing multiple facial fractures and severe brain trauma. The sustained nature of the attack spoke to a level of rage that seemed completely disconnected from any rational motive. But even that wasn't enough. In what prosecutors would later describe as an act of pure evil, Brian then took out a knife and slashed Marty's throat 3 to 4 times, leaving her to die alone in her basement. The cuts were so deep they severed major blood vessels and came within millimeters of completely cutting through her main artery. The crime scene told a story of unimaginable brutality. Blood covered the basement floor from corner to corner. The violence had been so extensive, so sustained, that investigators who had worked hundreds of cases said they'd never seen anything quite like it. This wasn't the work of someone who had lost control in a moment of anger. This was methodical, deliberate, and designed to ensure the victim would not survive. But Brian Pennington had made one critical miscalculation. He believed Marty was dead when he left her basement that morning. He had no way of knowing that this small, seemingly fragile woman possessed a strength that would defy every medical expectation. When investigators arrived at his door that evening, Brian appeared genuinely surprised to learn that Marty was still alive. His cooperation during the initial interview now made perfect sense. If he believed his victim was dead, then there would be no witness to identify him. The scratches on his face could be explained away. The blood on his jeans could be dismissed as something else entirely. He likely thought the investigation would focus elsewhere, perhaps on a stranger or someone with an obvious motive. The DNA evidence changed everything. When the lab confirmed that the blood on Brian's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators knew they had their man, but they still needed to understand the scope of who they were dealing with. Further investigation into Brian's background revealed a pattern of violence that painted a chilling picture of escalation. Records showed Brian had over 60 contacts with law enforcement officers throughout his young life. He had been involved in multiple domestic violence incidents that resulted in injuries to victims. 2 wives, 2 girlfriends, all had experienced his capacity for brutality. For Brian Pennington, beating women wasn't something new or unprecedented. It was a pattern of behavior that had been building towards something catastrophic. The revelation about Brian's history of domestic violence cast his wife Jessica's initial alibi in a different light. When detectives first interviewed her, she had seemed nervous, young, naive. She insisted her husband had been home with her during the entire time frame of the attack. But investigators suspected she was lying to protect him, possibly out of fear of what he might do to her if she told the truth. Jessica was only 20 years old with 2 young children. She had experienced Brian's violence firsthand and knew what he was capable of when crossed. Her initial lie wasn't born of loyalty, but of terror. She understood that cooperating with police could put her own life in danger. When investigators approached Jessica separately, away from her husband's presence, they were able to get her to open up about the truth. They explained to her how severely beaten Marty had been, how close she had come to dying, and how important it was for justice to be served. The human side of Jessica responded to this appeal. In a breakthrough moment for the case, Jessica broke down and admitted she had lied. Brian had not been home with her during the time of the attack. In fact, she revealed that her husband had a history of assaulting and threatening her as well. Her false alibi had been given out of fear, but learning about the extent of Marty's injuries helped her find the courage to tell the truth. Jessica's admission transformed her from a hostile witness protecting her abuser into one of the prosecution's most important allies. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing that Brian had no alibi for the morning of the attack, and that his pattern of violence against women extended far beyond what happened to Marty. As the case against Brian Pennington solidified, investigators felt confident they could secure a conviction. The DNA evidence was ironclad. Marty's identification was clear and unwavering. Jessica's recanted testimony eliminated Brian's alibi. The scratches on his face corroborated a physical struggle. Everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion, but the question that haunted everyone involved in the case remained unanswered. Why had Brian Pennington decided to brutally attack a woman who had hired him, paid him fairly, and treated him with respect? There had been no theft from Marty's home. Money and valuables were left untouched. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no history of conflict or disagreement between them. The randomness of the violence was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. If Brian could attack Marty without any apparent motive, then no one who had ever hired him or interacted with him was truly safe. The realization sent shockwaves through the community and raised uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people we invite into our homes and lives. For Marty's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and continued anguish. Relief that the monster who had nearly killed their loved one was behind bars. Anguish over the senseless nature of the crime and the long road to recovery that still lay ahead. The physical healing was only the beginning. The emotional and psychological trauma would take much longer to address. Marty herself faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding her life from the ground up. The brain injury had affected her balance, her vision, her hearing, her memory, and her ability to process information normally. Simple tasks that had once been automatic now required conscious effort and concentration. The strong, capable woman who had been known for her reliability and competence now struggled with basic functions, yet even as she fought to regain her physical abilities, Marty demonstrated the same determination that had kept her alive through the attack. With the support of her family and medical team, she began the slow process of recovery, knowing that her survival and her willingness to testify would be crucial to ensuring Brian Pennington faced justice for his crimes. The legal proceedings that followed would test everyone involved in ways they never imagined. Brian Pennington was charged with attempted first-degree murder, and the prosecution was determined to see him serve the maximum sentence allowed under law. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but in the American justice system, even the most clear-cut cases can take unexpected turns. As preparations for trial began, the prosecution team faced a critical decision about how to present their case. The DNA evidence on Pennington's genes was powerful, but they knew defense attorneys would try to create reasonable doubt wherever possible. The lack of a clear motive remained problematic, giving the defense room to argue that perhaps someone else had committed the crime. Marty's recovery continued slowly but steadily. The woman who had once been known for her sharp mind and quick wit now struggled with basic cognitive functions. Her speech was sometimes unclear, her memory had gaps, and her physical coordination remained impaired. The prosecution worried whether she would be strong enough to testify, and whether a jury would find her testimony credible given her brain injury. But Marty possessed something that no amount of physical trauma could destroy: an unshakable determination to see justice done. She worked tirelessly with speech therapists and physical rehabilitation specialists, driven by the knowledge that her testimony could be the key to putting her attacker behind bars. Her children watched in amazement as their mother fought to reclaim pieces of herself that had been stolen in those terrible minutes in her basement. The preliminary hearing arrived with tremendous anticipation and anxiety. This would be the first time Marty would face her attacker in a courtroom setting, and no one knew how she would react. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the prosecution failed to convince the judge there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, Pennington would walk free. When Pennington was brought into the courtroom, the contrast was stark. He sat alone on his side of the room, with no family members present to support him. Not even his mother had come. He stared straight ahead, showing no emotion, until Marty entered the courtroom. Only then did his head turn, his eyes following her slow, deliberate walk to the witness stand. Those who witnessed that moment described it as chilling. Pennington's expression seemed to convey disbelief that his victim was not only alive, but walking into court to testify against him. The ghost he thought he had created was very much real and very much determined to see him pay for what he had done. Marty's testimony was powerful in its simplicity. Despite her injuries and the trauma she had endured, her identification of Pennington was clear and unwavering. She looked directly at him as she spoke, showing a courage that inspired everyone in the courtroom. Her voice may have been weaker than before, but her words carried the weight of absolute truth. The prosecution's case was further strengthened when Jessica Pennington took the stand. Her decision to tell the truth about her husband's whereabouts that morning was crucial, but it came at great personal cost. She knew that by testifying against him, she was putting herself and her children at risk of retaliation. Yet she found the strength to do what was right. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. But as the case moved forward, unexpected developments began to emerge. Pennington's defense team, recognizing the strength of the evidence against their client, began exploring the possibility of a plea agreement. The prospect of facing a jury with DNA evidence, victim identification, and witness testimony seemed daunting even to experienced defense attorneys. Negotiations between the prosecution and defense stretched on for months. The central question was how much time Pennington would serve in prison. The prosecution wanted to ensure he would be locked away for as long as legally possible, while the defense sought to minimize his sentence. For Marty and her family, the uncertainty was agonizing. Eventually, both sides reached an agreement. Pennington would plead guilty to the charges against him in exchange for a sentence of 28.5 years in prison. For the prosecution, it guaranteed a significant prison term without the uncertainty of a jury trial. For Marty, it meant she wouldn't have to endure the grueling process of a full trial and could begin to find some closure. But even this resolution would not come without drama. On the day of sentencing, as family members prepared to deliver victim impact statements, Pennington shocked everyone by attempting to withdraw his guilty plea. After weeks of accepting responsibility for his actions, he suddenly claimed the pressure was too much and the sentence too long. The judge was having none of it. Pennington's reasons for wanting to withdraw his plea were deemed insufficient, and the sentencing proceeded as planned. One by one, Marty's family members stood before the court to tell Pennington exactly how his actions had affected their lives. Her teenage daughter's statement was particularly powerful. She looked directly at Pennington as she spoke about the trauma of seeing her mother in the hospital, about the fear that had consumed their family, about the strength they had found in each other. Even though Pennington refused to look at her, she knew he was hearing every word. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Marty herself stood before the man who had tried to kill her. Her voice was steady as she spoke about his betrayal of her trust, about the pain he had caused not just to her, but to everyone who loved her. She asked him the question that had haunted her since that terrible morning. "Why did you do this to me?" Pennington's response was silence. even given the opportunity to explain his actions, to show some remorse, to offer some understanding of what had driven him to such violence. He chose to say nothing. That silence spoke volumes about the kind of person he truly was. The judge sentenced Brian Pennington to 28.5 years in the Kansas state prison system. He would have to serve at least a significant portion of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole. For a man who had lived only 26 years, the prospect of spending more time behind bars than he had spent as a free man was sobering. Today, Marty Hill continues her recovery, forever changed, but never broken by what happened to her. The scars on her neck serve as a constant reminder of how close she came to death, but they also represent her incredible survival. She has returned to kickboxing, pushing herself physically as part of her ongoing rehabilitation. The woman who once weighed 97 pounds and was known as dynamite in a small package has proven that some forces of nature cannot be extinguished. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear a familiar face, that danger can come from the most unexpected sources. Brian Pennington wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was someone Marty knew, someone she had trusted, someone she had welcomed into her home. That betrayal of trust makes his crime even more heinous, and her survival even more remarkable. The question of motive may never be fully answered. Pennington's silence has left his victim and her family without the closure that understanding might bring. But perhaps that's fitting. Some acts of violence are so senseless, so devoid of rational explanation, that trying to understand them is futile. What matters is that justice was served, that a dangerous predator was removed from society, and that a remarkable woman found the strength to survive and rebuild her life. In the end, this case reminds us all to be vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to remember that sometimes the greatest threats come from those we least suspect. The stranger you know may be the most dangerous stranger of all. In a quiet military town along California's coast, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Louise Day simply vanished without a trace. But this wasn't your typical missing person case. For over 20 years, nobody even knew she was gone. The year was 1981. Ronald Reagan had just become president. MTV launched its first broadcast, and in the small town of Seaside, California, a young girl was about to disappear from existence entirely. Not just physically, but from all records, all memories, all traces of her life. What makes Mary Day's case so haunting isn't just that she vanished. It's that her own family never reported her missing. They never called the police, never filed a report, never even told the neighbors. For 2 decades, it was as if Mary Louise Day had never existed at all. This story begins not in 1981, but in 2002, when a woman named Sherry Calgaro walked into the Seaside Police Department with a question that would unravel one of the strangest missing person cases in California history. Sherry was looking for her sister Mary, who had disappeared when Sherry was just 10 years old. Detective Joe Bertina took the case, expecting it to be routine. Missing persons cases from the 80s were challenging, but not impossible. What he discovered instead was something far more disturbing. There was no record of Mary Louise Day anywhere. No social security activity, no driver's license, no credit cards, no employment records, nothing. It was as if she had simply been erased from existence. But the real mystery wasn't just where Mary had gone. It was why her own mother and stepfather had never bothered to look for her. The Day family had never been stable. Mary, along with her sisters Kathy and Sherry, had bounced between foster homes throughout their childhood. Their mother, Charlotte, struggled to care for them, and the girls were frequently separated. Eventually, Charlotte married William Hoole, a military man stationed at Fort Ord, and the family seemed to settle into a more permanent arrangement. But underneath the surface of this military family, something dark was brewing. Sherry remembered visiting her birth family years after Mary's disappearance, eager to reconnect with her sisters. When she asked about Mary, the response was chilling. Her sister Kathy pulled her aside and whispered urgently, telling her they weren't allowed to talk about Mary. The family had been instructed never to mention her name again. According to Sherry and Kathy, their parents had simply told them that Mary had run away. But running away was one thing. Never being reported missing was quite another. Detective Bertina began piecing together Mary's final days through interviews with her surviving family members. What emerged was a picture of an increasingly volatile household, where Mary seemed to be bearing the brunt of her stepfather's anger. The last time anyone remembered seeing Mary alive was during what appeared to be an ordinary evening at the family's home in Seaside. The family had gone out, leaving Mary and young Kathy at home alone. When they returned, they discovered their dog was sick and dying in the kitchen. William Hoole immediately accused Mary of poisoning the animal. According to Kathy's recollection, he flew into a rage, striking Mary so hard that blood ran from her mouth. That was the last time Kathy saw her sister alive. What happened next depends on who you ask. According to William and Charlotte, Mary simply ran away sometime during the night. They claimed she had done it before, so they weren't particularly concerned. But there were details that didn't add up. If Mary was a habitual runaway, why did William and Charlotte panic when they first discovered she was gone? Why did they never file a police report? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why did they continue collecting Mary's Social Security benefits long after she disappeared? As Detective Bertina dug deeper into the case, he discovered that the family had been receiving monthly checks due to Mary's biological father's death in an accident. These payments continued for years after Mary vanished, suggesting that her disappearance might have been financially motivated. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Bertina decided to search the family's former home in Seaside. He brought Kathy along, hoping her childhood memories might provide clues about what had happened to her sister. Kathy led detectives to a specific area of the backyard, where she remembered being forbidden to play. According to her recollection, William had explicitly told the children to stay away from one particular corner of the yard after Mary disappeared. When cadaver dogs were brought in to search the property, they immediately alerted to that exact spot. The handlers were confident that human remains had been buried there at some point. Investigators began digging, their hearts pounding as they imagined finally finding Mary's body. Instead, they found something else entirely. A small child's shoe, buried in the dirt where the dogs had indicated the presence of human remains. But there was no body. The dog handlers were puzzled but certain. Their animals didn't make mistakes like this. If they had alerted to human remains, then human remains had definitely been there. The only explanation was that the body had been moved. This discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a potential homicide. Detective Bertina was now convinced that Mary Louise Day had been murdered in 1981 and that her body had been buried in the family's backyard before being relocated to an unknown location. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The family's refusal to report Mary missing, their continued collection of her Social Security benefits, the forbidden area of the backyard, and the cadaver dog's alert all painted a picture of a cover-up that had lasted more than 20 years. But just as the case seemed to be building toward arrests, something completely unexpected happened. Something that would throw the entire investigation into chaos and leave everyone involved questioning everything they thought they knew about Mary Louise Day. In November 2003, police in Phoenix, Arizona, made a routine traffic stop. The vehicle had stolen plates, and when officers ran identification checks on the passengers, one name jumped out at them immediately. The woman sitting in that truck claimed to be Mary Louise Day. The news from Phoenix hit Detective Bertina like a lightning bolt. After months of building a murder case, after bringing in cadaver dogs and digging up backyards, after interviewing family members who seemed to be hiding a terrible secret, a woman claiming to be Mary Louise Day had just materialized 700 miles away. But the timing was more than suspicious. This woman had obtained her Arizona identification card just 3 weeks earlier, right in the middle of the active homicide investigation. It was as if someone had been watching the case unfold and decided to take action. When Bertina flew to Phoenix to meet this mysterious woman, he found someone who looked like she could be Mary Day. She was the right age, had similar features, and seemed to know basic details about the family. But something felt off about her story. The woman, who Bertina began calling Phoenix Mary in his reports, claimed she had run away from home as a teenager and had been living under the radar ever since. She said she had survived by using fake names and staying off the grid, which would explain why there were no official records of her existence for over 20 years. But when Bertina pressed her for details about that final night in Seaside, her memories seemed foggy and inconsistent. She remembered some kind of confrontation with William, and she recalled bleeding. But she couldn't remember anything about the sick dog that Kathy had described in such vivid detail. This was troubling to investigators. The dog incident was central to Kathy's account of Mary's final hours. If this woman was really Mary, how could she forget such a traumatic event? Phoenix Mary seemed increasingly frustrated with the questioning. During one phone conversation, she challenged the detective directly, asking how he would be able to prove who she was even if he found her body. It was an odd thing to say, and it only deepened Bertina's suspicions. The detective was convinced this woman was an imposter, but he needed proof. The solution was simple enough: a DNA test that would definitively determine whether she was Charlotte Hoole's biological daughter. Bertina was confident the test would expose the deception. There was no way this woman's DNA would match Charlotte's. Except it did. The results came back positive. Phoenix Mary was indeed Charlotte Hoole's biological daughter. The case was officially closed, and after more than 20 years, Mary Louise Day had apparently been found alive. But for many people involved in the investigation, the DNA results only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Sherry Calgaro, eager to reconnect with her long-lost sister, invited Phoenix Mary to move in with her. Finally, after decades of wondering what had happened to Mary, the family could be reunited. Yet, almost immediately, Sherry began noticing things that didn't seem right. The woman claiming to be her sister spoke with a pronounced Southern accent, which seemed strange considering Mary had spent her childhood moving between California and various military bases. Phoenix Mary also claimed she had abandoned her real name years ago and had been going by Monica Devereaux. Sherry found magazines in the house addressed to this name, which seemed to support the story. But there were other details that bothered her. The woman didn't remember their father's inheritance, money that all the Day children were supposed to collect when they turned 18. This had been their shared dream as children, their ticket to freedom from the troubled household. How could Mary have forgotten something so important, even more unsettling? She didn't remember the secret code word that she and Sherry had shared as children. They had called it Mohawk, and it was supposed to be their special signal if they ever needed to find each other again. Kathy, Mary's other sister, had an even stronger reaction when she met Phoenix Mary. Her gut instinct told her immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't the sister she remembered. The situation became even more bizarre when Phoenix Mary sent an email to Detective Bertina, claiming she had been lying about her identity. She seemed to be suggesting that she wasn't really Mary Day after all. Despite these red flags, the case remained officially closed. The DNA evidence was considered conclusive, and there didn't seem to be any compelling reason to reopen the investigation. But the story was far from over. In 2008, Steve Cercone, now Seaside's police chief, received another unexpected phone call. Investigators at Fort Ord, the former military base where the Hoole family had lived, were conducting an unrelated search with cadaver dogs when they made a startling discovery. The dogs had alerted to another location where the Hoole family had lived, a house they had moved to shortly after Mary's disappearance. Once again, the dogs indicated that human remains had been present at the site. This suggested something even more disturbing than investigators had previously imagined. Had Mary's body been moved not once, but twice were the Hooles systematically relocating evidence as they moved from base to base. Cercone felt compelled to reopen the investigation, even though the case had been officially closed. Too many questions remained unanswered. He hired Mark Clark, a retired homicide detective from nearby Salinas, to take a fresh look at all the evidence. Clark's review of the case files convinced him that Mary Louise Day had been murdered in 1981, and that Phoenix Mary was an elaborate imposter. He developed a theory that seemed to explain all the inconsistencies, though he admitted it was somewhat far-fetched. Clark believed that Charlotte Hoole had given birth to another daughter years before Mary, a child she had given up for adoption and kept secret from the rest of the family. When the murder investigation began heating up in 2003, Clark theorized William and Charlotte had reached out to this secret daughter and convinced her to assume Mary's identity. The motive, according to Clark, was the inheritance money that Mary would have been entitled to collect. By that time, with accumulated interest, the sum had grown to approximately $60,000. This theory would explain Phoenix Mary's southern accent if she had been raised in a different part of the country. It would explain why she didn't remember family secrets or important details from Mary's childhood. And it would explain the convenient timing of her appearance, just as the murder investigation was gaining momentum. Clark also pointed to William Hoole's own words during his police interview. The stepfather had come tantalizingly close to confessing, saying that while he hadn't killed Mary, the demon inside him might have done it. In Clark's opinion, this was as close to an admission of guilt as they were likely to get. The retired detective believed that William and Charlotte had torn up Mary's pictures, thrown away her clothes, and told their other children never to speak her name again because they were covering up a murder. The fact that they had continued collecting her Social Security benefits for years only strengthened his conviction that this was a premeditated crime. But Clark's theory, while compelling, remained just that, a theory. He had no concrete proof that Phoenix Mary was an imposter, and the DNA evidence seemed to contradict his hypothesis. The case remained in limbo, officially closed, but unofficially still generating doubts and questions among those who had worked on it. In 2017, a new detective took charge of the Mary Day case. Detective Judy Veloz approached the investigation with fresh eyes and a determination to separate fact from speculation. She wasn't interested in theories or hunches. She wanted hard evidence. Veloz began by re-examining the physical evidence that had convinced so many people that a murder had taken place. That child's shoe found in the backyard, for instance. When she held it in her palm, she realized it was extremely small, far too small for a 13-year-old girl of Mary's height and build. The shoe that had seemed like such damning evidence suddenly appeared to be nothing more than a coincidence. She also took a closer look at the DNA results that had closed the case in 2003. Additional testing had been conducted over the years, and the results were consistent. Phoenix Mary's DNA matched not only Charlotte Hoole, but also Mary's biological father. The genetic evidence was overwhelming. But Velaz wanted to hear from Mary herself. The woman claiming to be Mary Louise Day was now living in Missouri, battling late-stage cancer. Her health was failing rapidly, and Velaz knew this might be her last chance to get answers. The interview lasted 90 minutes, and what Velaz heard convinced her that this was indeed the real Mary Day. The woman was able to fill in gaps in her story that had previously seemed suspicious. She explained that she had started calling herself Monica shortly after running away because she didn't want police to track her down and return her to William and Charlotte. Mary also introduced Velaz to a crucial figure from her past, a woman named Maury Kimmel, who had taken Mary in when she was just 15 years old. Kimmel remembered Mary as naive and childlike, someone who had clearly been through trauma but was trying to survive on her own. Kimmel's testimony helped explain many of the inconsistencies that had fueled the imposter theories. Mary had lived with Kimmel's family for about a year, one of the few stable periods in her adult life. But one day, she simply disappeared again, leaving Kimmel heartbroken and wondering what had happened to the young woman she had tried to help. The investigation revealed that Mary had spent decades moving from city to city, living on the margins of society and struggling with alcoholism. This transient lifestyle explained why there were so few official records of her existence. She had deliberately avoided creating a paper trail that might lead authorities back to her childhood home. Velaz also solved the mystery of why Mary had suddenly obtained that Arizona identification card in 2003. She had needed surgery to remove her gallbladder and required state assistance to pay for the procedure. A local nonprofit organization had helped her track down her birth certificate so she could get proper identification in her real name. The Southern accent that had bothered so many people also had a logical explanation. Mary had spent time in various parts of the country during her decades of wandering, and speech patterns can change over time, especially for someone who had been drinking heavily for years. As for that mysterious email Mary had sent to Detective Bertina, claiming she had been lying about her identity, Velaz discovered that Mary had sent a follow-up message trying to clarify her meaning. She explained that she had been confused and wasn't sure what she was trying to say in the original email. This was consistent with someone struggling with severe alcoholism and the cognitive effects of long-term substance abuse. The smoking gun in Velaz's investigation came from an unexpected source. One of Maury Kimmel's relatives had kept a photograph of Mary, taken at least a year after her alleged murder in 1981. This picture clearly showed Mary as a teenager, alive and well, long after she was supposed to have been killed. Velaz submitted this photograph to TrueFace, a state-of-the-art facial recognition company. Their algorithms compared the teenage Mary in the photograph with later pictures of Phoenix Mary, and the results were conclusive. There was a 99% probability that they were the same person. With this evidence in hand, Velaz submitted her final report and officially closed the Mary Day investigation for good. After decades of speculation and conspiracy theories, the case was finally resolved. Mary Louise Day had not been murdered in 1981. She had run away from an abusive home and spent the rest of her life trying to survive on her own terms. 9 days after Velaz interviewed her, Mary Day died from cancer. There was no funeral. The woman who had been at the center of one of California's most bizarre missing person cases passed away quietly. Her story finally told, but even with the case officially closed, some people remained unconvinced. Mark Clark, the retired detective who had developed the imposter theory, admitted that Velaz's report made him question his own investigation, but he couldn't entirely shake his suspicions. Steve Cercone, the former police chief, also found himself leaning toward accepting that Phoenix Mary was indeed the real Mary Louise Day after seeing the photographic evidence. But he remained certain that the cadaver dogs had detected something significant at both burial sites. The truth is that we may never know exactly what happened in the Hoole household in 1981. The cadaver dogs don't lie. As their handlers repeatedly insisted, they detected human remains at two separate locations where the family had lived. But whose remains were they detecting? Perhaps William Hoole was responsible for another death that was never reported. Perhaps there were other victims whose stories have never been told. Or perhaps the dogs were detecting very old remains that had nothing to do with the Hoole family at all. What we do know is that Mary Louise Day survived her childhood ordeal and lived for 36 more years after supposedly being murdered. She never had an easy life, but she managed to survive on her own terms, far from the people who had failed to protect her as a child. The Mary Day case serves as a stark reminder of how the system can fail vulnerable children. Mary was bounced between foster homes, returned to an abusive household, and disappeared without anyone in authority noticing or caring. For 20 years, not a single official asked where she had gone. It also demonstrates how conspiracy theories can take on a life of their own, especially when they seem to explain mysterious circumstances. The imposter theory was compelling because it accounted for so many odd details, but ultimately it was wrong. In the end, Mary Louise Day's story is not one of murder and cover-up, but of survival against overwhelming odds. A 13-year-old girl found the courage to escape an impossible situation and built a life for herself, however difficult and imperfect it may have been. She deserved better from the adults who were supposed to care for her. She deserved better from the system that was supposed to protect her. But she found a way to survive, and that survival was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The mystery of what happened to Mary Day has finally been solved. She lived, she struggled, and she endured. And maybe, in its own way, that's the most important truth of all. The alarm went off at 5:15 in the morning, just like it had every single day for years. But on March 1st, 2019, the bed where Andreen McDonald should have been stirring was already empty. Her husband Andre claimed he had no idea where she was, within hours. What started as a simple welfare check would transform into one of San Antonio's most disturbing criminal cases. A successful businesswoman had vanished without a trace from her gated community home, leaving behind a trail of blood, a mysterious burn pile, and a husband whose story kept changing. Good morning, and welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into a case that shattered the American dream and exposed the dark secrets lurking behind a picture-perfect marriage. This is the story of Andreen McDonald, a millionaire who disappeared in the middle of the night, and the investigation that would reveal just how far someone might go to destroy the life they helped create. Before we get started, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because cases like this one require multiple parts to tell the full story. You won't want to miss what comes next. Now, let me paint you a picture of what success looked like in San Antonio's upscale neighborhoods. Andreen McDonald was living proof that the American dream was still achievable if you had the drive and determination to make it happen. At just 29 years old, this Jamaican immigrant had built something extraordinary from absolutely nothing. Picture this: a young woman arriving in America with little more than hope and ambition, meeting an Air Force officer who believed in her vision, and together building a multi-million-dollar empire. That's exactly what Andreen accomplished when she founded Starlight Homes, an assisted living business that started with just 3 residents in her own home and grew into a thriving enterprise with multiple locations across the San Antonio area. But here's what made Andreen different from your typical successful entrepreneur. She wasn't just about the money or the status. This woman had a routine that would put military personnel to shame. Every single morning, 5:30 sharp, she'd be at the gym. No excuses, no exceptions. By 8 o'clock, she'd be in her office, ready to tackle whatever challenges the day might bring. Her employees knew they could set their watches by her arrival. Her dedication wasn't just impressive, it was legendary. This wasn't someone who took days off on a whim or disappeared without explanation. Andreen McDonald was the definition of reliability. So when March 1st rolled around and Andreen didn't show up for work, alarm bells should have been ringing immediately. But sometimes the people closest to us are the last to recognize when something's terribly wrong. The call came in from her mother, Maureen, who had been trying to reach her daughter all morning. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. Text messages went unanswered. For a woman who was in constant communication with her family and business partners, this silence was deafening. When Bexar County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the McDonald residence in their gated community, they expected to find a simple explanation. Maybe Andreen had gotten sick and was sleeping off a migraine. Maybe there had been a family emergency that required her immediate attention. What they definitely didn't expect to find was evidence of violence. The house itself told a story that nobody wanted to read. On the surface, everything looked normal. The furniture was in place, nothing appeared to be stolen, and there were no obvious signs of a break-in. But when you looked closer, when you knew what to look for, the details became chilling. There was blood on the bathroom wall. Not a lot, but enough to catch a trained investigator's eye. Mixed in with that blood were strands of hair, and outside in the backyard, where Andreen had once maintained a beautiful garden, there was now a burn pile that hadn't been there before. Now, let's talk about Andre McDonald for a moment. This wasn't some random stranger who had wandered into their lives. This was Andreen's husband of several years, a major in the United States Air Force with top-secret security clearance. This was the man who had brought Andreen to America in the first place, who had liquidated his own retirement fund to help her start her business, who had been by her side as they built their fortune together. When deputies questioned Andre about his wife's whereabouts, his story seemed straightforward enough. He claimed that he had woken up that morning, gotten their young daughter Elena ready for school, and headed off to his duties at Lackland Air Force Base, where he worked as a cyber warfare analyst. Just another routine day in what appeared to be a routine marriage. But here's where things get interesting. Andre told investigators that when he learned his wife was missing, his first instinct was to check the local hospitals. He had a hunch. He said that maybe Andreen had suffered one of her severe migraines and had driven herself to get medical treatment. The surveillance cameras at the hospital captured Andre arriving and asking about a patient named McDonald. The staff directed him to room 3, where indeed there was a McDonald receiving treatment. Andre seemed relieved as he headed back home to share the good news with the deputies who were waiting for him. Except there was one problem. When the deputies called the hospital to verify Andre's story, they discovered that the McDonald in room 3 wasn't Andreen McDonald at all. It was a completely different person who just happened to share the same last name. So now we have to ask ourselves, was this an honest mistake made by a worried husband? Or was this the first crack in a carefully constructed lie? Andre's explanation was that he had rushed back home before actually confirming his wife's identity because he had forgotten his cell phone and wanted to call Andreen's mother to share the good news. He claimed there had been some indication that his wife was injured and receiving treatment, but unfortunately, his hunch had turned out to be wrong. But investigators were starting to notice patterns that didn't quite add up. While Andre appeared to be cooperative on the surface, There were inconsistencies in his timeline and gaps in his story that raised red flags. The more they dug into the MacDonald marriage, the more complex the picture became. From the outside, Andre and Andréan appeared to be the perfect power couple. He was the decorated military officer with his steady government salary and security clearance. She was the entrepreneurial dynamo who had transformed a small home-based business into a multi-million-dollar operation. Friends described them as being deeply in love, always laughing together, constantly supporting each other's dreams and ambitions. Andre had sacrificed financially to help Andréan get her business off the ground, selling his BMW and cashing in his retirement savings to give her the capital she needed. And for a while, it seemed like that sacrifice had paid off beautifully. Starlight Homes wasn't just successful, it was thriving beyond anyone's wildest expectations. Within 7 years, what had started as a small operation caring for 3 elderly residents had grown into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that employed dozens of people and served the San Antonio community. Andréan herself had become something of a local celebrity in the assisted living industry. She was known for her hands-on approach, her genuine care for the residents in her facilities, and her commitment to providing quality care for some of society's most vulnerable members. But success, as many of us know, can be a double-edged sword. The same drive and ambition that had made Andréan so successful in business had also made her the primary breadwinner in the MacDonald household. While André had his military salary, it was Andréan's business acumen that had generated the real wealth in their family. And sometimes, when the traditional gender roles in a marriage get flipped, when the wife becomes more financially successful than the husband, it can create tensions that aren't immediately visible to the outside world. As investigators continued their initial examination of the MacDonald home, they began to uncover evidence that suggested the picture-perfect marriage might not have been quite so perfect after all. The blood and hair in the bathroom were concerning enough, but there were other clues that painted a more troubling picture. The burn pile in the backyard wasn't just random debris. When crime scene technicians sifted through the ashes, they found something that made everyone's blood run cold: the zipper from one of Andréan's blouses. The fabric had been completely consumed by flames, but metal doesn't burn as easily as cloth. This wasn't someone disposing of old yard waste or having a casual bonfire. This was someone trying to destroy evidence, trying to eliminate any trace of what had happened in that house on the night of February 28th and the early morning hours of March 1st. But if André MacDonald thought he had covered his tracks, he was about to learn just how difficult it is to make someone disappear completely in the modern world. Every purchase leaves a paper trail. Every movement can be captured by surveillance cameras. Every lie can be exposed by forensic science. The investigation was just getting started, and the secrets that the MacDonald marriage had been hiding were about to be dragged into the harsh light of day. Because when a millionaire vanishes from her own home, leaving behind nothing but blood and ashes, someone has to answer for what happened in those final moments. And André MacDonald was about to discover that his story had more holes than he'd realized. The reality of modern investigations is that secrets don't stay buried for long. Within days of Andréan's disappearance, investigators had uncovered a web of deception that stretched far beyond that blood-stained bathroom and mysterious burn pile. André MacDonald's cooperation with law enforcement came to an abrupt halt when he realized the questions weren't going to stop with simple explanations. On March 2nd, less than 24 hours after his wife was reported missing, André made a decision that spoke volumes about his state of mind. He stopped talking to investigators and immediately hired a lawyer. Now, you might think that's just smart legal strategy. After all, innocent people have the right to legal representation too. But when your spouse is missing and every hour counts in terms of finding them alive, choosing to lawyer up instead of helping with the search sends a pretty clear message to investigators. What happened next was like watching a man unravel in real time. While law enforcement continued processing the crime scene and searching for any trace of Andréen, they assigned an undercover investigator to keep tabs on André's movements. And what they observed over the next few days would convince them that they weren't dealing with a grieving husband anymore. On March 2nd, that undercover investigator noticed something strange. The garage at the McDonald residence had been damaged somehow, and André was backing his vehicle out of the driveway with what appeared to be urgent purpose. The investigator followed at a distance, wondering where André might be headed during one of the most critical periods in the search for his missing wife. The destination was chilling in its implications. André drove straight to a local gun shop, where surveillance cameras captured him purchasing a 9mm handgun and ammunition. Think about that for a moment. While search teams were combing through wooded areas and volunteers were posting missing person flyers around San Antonio, André McDonald was buying a weapon. Investigators had to make a split-second decision about what this purchase might mean. Was André planning to harm himself? Was he planning to harm someone else? Or was there something even more sinister at play? They couldn't take any chances. As André walked back toward his car, investigators moved in and took him down in what can only be described as a violent confrontation. The man who had been portraying himself as a concerned husband was suddenly face down on the asphalt, being detained by the very people who were supposed to be helping him find his wife. André was immediately turned over to military authorities for a psychological evaluation, but investigators weren't done with their search of his property. Armed with a search warrant, they returned to the McDonald residence and began examining André's vehicle more thoroughly. What they found in that car was like a shopping list for body disposal: a shovel, an axe, a hatchet, trash bags, gloves, multiple gas cans. These weren't tools you'd need for regular home maintenance or yard work. These were items specifically chosen for a much darker purpose. But the real bombshell was waiting inside the family's garbage can. Hidden among the regular household refuse, investigators found a receipt from Lowe's hardware store. The receipt was torn up, as if someone had tried to destroy it, but hadn't quite finished the job. When they pieced it together, the items listed matched exactly what they had found in André's car. The timestamp on that receipt was crucial. These items had been purchased on March 2nd, the day after Andréen went missing. While her family was frantically searching for any sign of her, while volunteers were organizing search parties, André McDonald had been shopping for tools to dispose of a body. Security footage from the Lowe's store showed André methodically selecting each item. A shovel went into his cart. 2 gas cans followed, then a maul and an axe. The man on that surveillance video wasn't behaving like someone whose wife had mysteriously vanished. He was behaving like someone who knew exactly where she was and what needed to be done to keep anyone else from finding her. In the corner of the McDonald garage, investigators made their most damning discovery yet: a claw hammer, stained with what laboratory tests would later confirm was Andréen's blood. Nearby, they found clothing that belonged to André, also bearing traces of his wife's blood. For Detective Frank Stubbs, this evidence painted a clear picture of what had happened in the McDonald home during the early morning hours of March 1st. The hammer had been used as a weapon. The blood evidence showed that Andréen had been attacked in her own home. And André's subsequent shopping trip proved that he had spent the hours after her disappearance preparing to cover up his crime. But here's the challenge that investigators faced: having evidence of a crime and being able to prove exactly what happened are 2 completely different things. Despite all the blood evidence, despite the suspicious purchases, despite André's changing story and refusal to cooperate, they still didn't have Andréen's body. Turning a missing persons case into a homicide prosecution is incredibly difficult without a victim. Prosecutors need to be able to prove not just that someone died, but how they died, when they died, and who was responsible for their death. And all of that becomes exponentially harder when the primary evidence is missing. On March 3rd, after the Air Force completed its psychological evaluation and determined that Andre wasn't an immediate danger to himself, civil authorities moved quickly to arrest him, but they couldn't charge him with murder. Not yet. Instead, Andre MacDonald was arrested for tampering with evidence. Based on that torn receipt and the tools found in his possession, the arrest sent shockwaves through the San Antonio community and devastated both sides of the MacDonald family. Andre's mother, Jackie, was in complete disbelief. This was her son, a decorated military officer, someone she had raised to be responsible and honorable. The idea that he could harm anyone, let alone his own wife, seemed impossible to accept. Andre's family was struggling with their own conflicting emotions. On one hand, they wanted justice for what they believed had happened to their daughter and sister. On the other hand, they were dealing with the horrible reality that the man they had welcomed into their family, the man who had brought Andrian to America and helped her build her dreams, might be responsible for destroying everything she had worked for. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this entire tragedy was the impact on 7-year-old Elena MacDonald. This little girl had gone to bed on February 28th with both of her parents in the house. She had woken up on March 1st to find her mother gone and her father acting strangely. And now, just days later, her father was being arrested while her mother was still missing. The community response to Andrian's disappearance was overwhelming. Former Air Force serviceman Bobby Green organized volunteer search parties that covered hundreds of miles of terrain around San Antonio. These weren't professional search and rescue teams. These were ordinary citizens who had been touched by Andrian's story and wanted to help bring her home. They searched wooded areas behind hospitals, thinking Andre might have chosen locations that were familiar to him. They looked for disturbed earth, broken branches, tire tracks, anything that might indicate where a body had been hidden. Day after day, week after week. These volunteers continued their efforts even as hope began to fade. Meanwhile, Andre was released from jail while awaiting trial on the evidence tampering charges. Incredibly, he took over management of Starlight Homes, the business that Andrian had built from nothing. The same facilities that had been her pride and joy were now being run by the man suspected of killing her. As investigators dug deeper into the MacDonald marriage, they discovered that the picture-perfect relationship had been hiding some serious cracks. Text messages and social media posts revealed ongoing arguments about money, business decisions, and control. There were allegations of infidelity on both sides, accusations about who deserved credit for their business success, and increasingly heated exchanges about the direction of their relationship. Friends who had once described the MacDonalds as the ideal couple began sharing stories that painted a different picture. There had been physical altercations before, moments of tension that had made people uncomfortable. The night before a Christmas party in 2018, witnesses described seeing Andre and Andrian grappling on their kitchen floor, fighting over something that had escalated beyond words. For 4 months, the search for Andrian continued with no results. Investigators followed up on hundreds of tips, searched dozens of locations, and interviewed anyone who might have information about what had happened to her. But Texas is a big state, and hiding a body in the vast stretches of rural land around San Antonio wouldn't be impossible for someone who knew what they were doing. Then, on July 11th, 2019, 133 days after Andrian MacDonald had vanished from her home, A farmer named Clifton Cundiff made a discovery that would finally bring this case to its tragic conclusion. Cundiff had taken his tractor out to retrieve a cow skull that had been spotted along the tree line of his property, about 6 miles from the McDonald residence. But when he got closer to examine what he thought was just another piece of farm debris, he realized he was looking at something much more significant. There, partially concealed by vegetation and scattered by months of exposure to the elements, were human skeletal remains. The bones that Clifton Cundiff had stumbled upon belonged to Andrian McDonald. The discovery of Andrian's body changed everything about this case. What had been a missing persons investigation with charges of evidence tampering suddenly became a murder case with physical proof of the crime. Andre McDonald was arrested again, this time charged with the murder of his wife. The trial that followed would reveal the full extent of what had happened in the McDonald home during those final hours. Andre's own testimony would provide details that no one could have imagined, admitting to actions that were so brutal and calculated that they shocked even experienced investigators. After being found guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, Andre McDonald was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The jury had rejected his claims of self-defense but couldn't unanimously agree that his actions had been premeditated murder. Today, Andrian's mother Maureen and sister Cindy are raising young Elena, trying to help her process the unimaginable trauma of losing both parents in such a violent way. The Starlight Homes business that Andrian had built with such dedication and care has been closed. Another casualty of the violence that destroyed the McDonald family. The American dream that Andrian McDonald had pursued so successfully had been cut short by the very person who had helped her achieve it. Her story serves as a reminder that success and wealth can't protect us from the people closest to us, and that sometimes the greatest dangers come from within our own homes. Andrian McDonald came to America with nothing but hope and determination. She built an empire, touched countless lives through her work, and created something meaningful that served her community. Her legacy should have been one of inspiration and achievement. Instead, it became a cautionary tale about trust, ambition, and the devastating consequences when love turns to jealousy and control. If you found this case as compelling and tragic as I did, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell. Cases like this one require us to examine the complex dynamics of domestic relationships and the warning signs that might help prevent future tragedies. Let me know in the comments what aspects of this case you found most disturbing, and what you think could have been done differently to save Andrian's life. Until next time, stay safe out there. And remember that the people we trust the most sometimes have the greatest power to hurt us. The quiet streets of Quincy, Illinois had never seen anything quite like this before. A brutal execution in broad daylight. A mother of 3 gunned down in her own bathroom. And at the center of it all, a game show answer that would echo through a murder trial. This is a story about secrets hidden behind suburban facades, about a marriage that crumbled into something deadly, and about how a single moment on national television can take on an entirely different meaning when viewed through the lens of tragedy. On a cold February morning in 2023, the unthinkable happened in this Mississippi river town, where everyone knows everyone. Becky Bleefnick, a beloved nurse and devoted mother, was found dead in the most horrific circumstances imaginable. She had been shot 14 times. 14 times. Each bullet a deliberate act of violence that would shatter not just her family, but an entire community's sense of safety. The crime scene told a story of pure terror. Someone had scaled the outside of her house in the dead of night, pried open a second-story window, and hunted her down like prey. When Becky tried to call for help, her phone was knocked from her hands. She fled to her bathroom, but there was nowhere left to run. The killer stood over her and fired shot after shot until she was gone. But this wasn't a random break-in gone wrong. This wasn't some stranger looking for valuables to steal. This was personal. This was execution. And investigators would soon discover that the answer to who killed Becky Bliefnick might have been hiding in plain sight all along. 4 years before Becky's murder, her husband Tim stood on a brightly lit game show stage, facing host Steve Harvey and a studio full of cheering fans. The question seemed innocent enough. What's the biggest mistake you made at your wedding without missing a beat? Tim looked directly into the camera and delivered an answer that would later send chills down the spines of everyone who heard it. "Honey, I love you, but I said I do." The studio audience erupted in laughter. Steve Harvey doubled over. Even Tim's own family members standing beside him broke into grins. It was just a game show moment, a throwaway line meant to get a laugh and maybe win some points. But when those words resurfaced after Becky's brutal murder, they took on a meaning that nobody could have imagined, because by then, Tim Bliefnick was sitting in a jail cell, charged with his wife's murder. The story of Tim and Becky began like so many others. They met as college students at Quincy University, two young people with their whole lives ahead of them. For years, they seemed to have it all figured out. Tim built a successful career in the recycling industry, while Becky devoted herself to raising their 3 young sons. From the outside, they looked like the perfect American family. But perfection, as we all know, is often just an illusion. Behind closed doors, cracks were beginning to show. Friends and family members would later describe a relationship where control became more important than love, where manipulation replaced partnership. Becky, who had once been content as a stay-at-home mother, began to dream of something more. She wanted to go back to school, to become a nurse, to build a career of her own. Tim wasn't supportive of those dreams. In fact, he seemed threatened by them. When Becky finally did pursue her nursing degree, the tension in their marriage reached a breaking point. She was flourishing in her new role, helping patients and saving lives. But at home, things were falling apart. The woman who had once deferred to her husband's wishes was finding her voice, and Tim didn't like what he was hearing. In January 2021, Tim filed for divorce. But if he thought that would give him back the control he craved, he was wrong. What followed was nearly 2 years of bitter legal battles over money, property, and most importantly, custody of their 3 children. The divorce proceedings revealed just how toxic their relationship had become. Court documents painted a picture of escalating conflict, with both sides hurling accusations. Tim sought a restraining order against Becky, claiming she was harassing him. Becky fired back with her own concerns about Tim's behavior, telling friends and family that she feared for her safety. Most chilling of all was a text message Becky sent to her sister more than a year before her death. "If something ever happens to me, please make sure the number 1 person of interest is Tim." It was a message that would prove prophetic in the most tragic way possible. As their divorce dragged on, Becky's fears seemed to intensify. She told friends about hearing voices in her backyard and motion detectors going off at odd hours. Her next-door neighbors had installed a security camera after some car break-ins, and what that camera captured in the weeks leading up to Becky's murder would become crucial evidence. The footage showed a shadowy figure walking down the driveway that ran alongside Becky's house. Not once, but multiple times. Always in the middle of the night. Always when Becky would be home alone with her children sleeping upstairs. Someone was watching her. Someone was learning her routines, her vulnerabilities, her schedule. Someone was planning the night of February 22nd into the early morning hours of February 23rd. 2023, that plan was put into action. While most of Quincy slept peacefully, a killer made their way through the darkness toward Becky's home. They brought with them a crowbar to pry open windows, gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints, and most importantly, a loaded 9mm handgun. What happened next was captured not by video cameras, but by the cold, hard evidence left behind at the scene. The killer had climbed onto Becky's roof using a patio chair, then moved past several easier entry points to reach a second-story window in one of her children's bedrooms. They pried it open and climbed inside. Becky was in her bedroom when she heard the intrusion. In a moment of pure terror, she managed to dial 911 on her cell phone, but before she could speak to an operator, the phone was knocked from her hands. She ran toward her bathroom, perhaps hoping to lock herself inside, but her attacker was right behind her. The killer fired 14 shots. 14 deliberate, calculated shots that ensured Becky would never leave that bathroom alive. But here's what makes this crime even more chilling. None of those wounds were immediately fatal. Becky lay dying on that cold bathroom floor for minutes, alone and in agony, while her killer calmly walked away. When Becky's father discovered her body hours later, he found a scene that would haunt the investigators for months to come. Shell casings scattered across the floor, pieces of plastic that would later be identified as fragments from grocery store bags. And most telling of all, a partial shoe print that suggested this was no random crime. This was personal. This was planned. And this was about to become one of the most shocking murder cases in Illinois history. The investigation that followed would uncover a web of surveillance videos, DNA evidence, and digital footprints that painted a disturbing picture of obsession and control. It would reveal internet searches for homemade silencers and techniques for cleaning gunpowder off hands. It would expose a fake social media account used to track down information about Becky's new romantic relationships. And at the center of it all would be Tim Bleefnick, the man who had once joked about regretting his marriage on national television, now facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars for allegedly ending that marriage in the most violent way imaginable. But Tim maintained his innocence. He had an alibi. He claimed he was home with their 3 children that night, being the devoted father he had always been. The evidence against him was circumstantial. His lawyers argued coincidental, the product of investigators who had rushed to judgment and targeted the most obvious suspect. The question that would consume the small town of Quincy for months was simple, yet profound. Was Tim Bleefnick a grieving ex-husband wrongly accused of a horrific crime? Or was he a calculating killer who had planned the perfect murder? The truth about what happened that night would have to be pieced together from fragments of evidence, digital breadcrumbs, and the testimony of those who knew Tim and Becky best. And as investigators dug deeper into the case, they discovered that the warning signs had been there all along. Becky's sister Sarah had never trusted Tim completely, but even she was shocked by the brutality of what had happened. When the call came that February morning, she knew immediately who was responsible. It wasn't intuition or guesswork. It was the culmination of months of watching her sister live in fear, of hearing about strange incidents and threatening behavior that had escalated as their divorce proceedings dragged on. The surveillance footage from the neighbor's security camera became a crucial piece of the puzzle. Those grainy images of someone walking down the driveway in the dead of night weren't random occurrences. They were reconnaissance missions. Someone was studying Becky's routine, learning when she was most vulnerable, planning the perfect moment to strike. But who was that shadowy figure? The video quality was too poor to make out a face or even determine if it was a man or woman. What investigators could see was someone on a bicycle, riding through the neighborhood at hours when no normal person would be out in the cold Illinois winter. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Every time that figure appeared on camera, it corresponded with other suspicious activity in the area. When police began canvassing the neighborhood for more evidence, they found that bicycle less than half a block from Tim's house. It was a blue Schwinn with no reflectors on the wheels, matching exactly what had been captured on the security footage. But Tim insisted it wasn't his bike, that he'd never seen it before, that its proximity to his home was just another unfortunate coincidence in a case built on circumstantial evidence. His defense team would argue that point repeatedly during the trial. Yes, Tim and Becky had been going through a bitter divorce. Yes, he had made some questionable internet searches. Yes, there were shell casings in his home that matched the murder weapon. But none of that proved he was a killer. It just proved he was a man going through the most difficult period of his life. The prosecution saw things very differently. They believed they were looking at a carefully orchestrated murder carried out by someone who knew Becky's habits intimately. The killer had bypassed multiple easier entry points to climb through a second-story window in a child's bedroom. They knew that particular room would be empty that night because Tim had the children staying with him. Even more damning was the timing. Becky was murdered just 1 week before their divorce case was scheduled to go to trial. Court documents revealed that Becky had been preparing to present testimony about Tim's father that could have been devastating to the family's reputation. She wanted supervised visitation only, citing concerns about the children's safety and well-being. For a man who prosecutors described as obsessed with control and public image, the thought of those allegations becoming public might have been unbearable. They painted a picture of Tim as someone who would rather see Becky dead than allow her to expose family secrets or win custody of their children. The digital evidence told its own story. Tim's phone revealed hundreds of searches related to his ex-wife's new romantic relationship. On Valentine's Day, just a week before the murder, someone had been spotted on the neighbor's security camera while Becky's new boyfriend's truck was parked in her driveway. Within minutes of that sighting, Tim's phone showed extensive searches for that man's license plate number and vehicle identification number. It was the behavior of someone consumed by jealousy and rage. Prosecutors argued, someone who couldn't accept that Becky had moved on with her life while he remained trapped in the past. The murder weapon itself provided perhaps the most compelling evidence. Police found spent shell casings in Tim's home that forensic experts determined had been fired from the same gun used to kill Becky. It was a 9mm handgun that Becky had once given Tim as a gift. Back when their marriage was happy and they still trusted each other completely, when their relationship soured and Becky filed for protection orders, she had specifically requested that Tim return that gun. Court records showed she wanted it back because it was registered in her name, but Tim claimed he no longer had it, that he hadn't seen it in years. According to prosecutors, he was lying. They believed he had kept that gun specifically to use against her when the moment was right. The plastic fragments found at the crime scene told another part of the story. Forensic analysis revealed they came from grocery store bags, the kind every household accumulates over time. But these weren't just random pieces of plastic. They appeared to have been used deliberately, possibly to muffle the sound of gunshots or catch shell casings as they were ejected from the weapon. DNA evidence found on those plastic fragments couldn't definitively prove Tim's guilt, but it couldn't exclude him either. The same was true for genetic material found under Becky's fingernails. She had fought for her life in those final moments, scratching and clawing at her attacker, potentially leaving crucial evidence behind. Tim's defense team, led by attorney Casey Schnook, attacked every piece of evidence methodically, The DNA was inconclusive. The shell casings could have been planted. The internet searches were taken out of context. The bicycle could have belonged to anyone. They painted their client as a devoted father who would never orphan his own children by murdering their mother. But the prosecution had one more card to play. They revealed that on the morning of Becky's murder, hours before her body was discovered, Tim had delivered a children's basketball hoop to his father's house. It was a seemingly innocent gesture that took on sinister implications when viewed through the lens of what they knew about the case. Why would a grieving husband be running errands and making deliveries on the same day his ex-wife lay dead in her bathroom? Unless, of course, he already knew she was never going to be a problem again. The trial that followed would captivate the small town of Quincy and draw national attention. Here was a case that had everything: a brutal murder, a bitter divorce, family secrets, and that haunting game show appearance that seemed to predict the tragedy to come. Tim Bleefnick sat in the defendant's chair, maintaining his innocence even as witness after witness testified about his controlling behavior, his obsessive monitoring of Becky's activities, and his desperate attempts to maintain power over a woman who was finally ready to break free. The jury would have to decide whether they were looking at a cold-blooded killer who had planned the perfect murder, or an innocent man caught in a web of circumstantial evidence and coincidence. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the outcome would determine whether Tim spent the rest of his life behind bars or walked free to raise the 3 children who had already lost their mother. When the verdict was read on that May afternoon in 2023, the courtroom fell silent, except for the sound of breathing. Guilty of first-degree murder. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, which in many ways they were. Tim Bleefnick showed no emotion as the judge's gavel came down. His family members in the gallery began to weep. Becky's family finally exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Justice, they said, had been served. But justice couldn't bring back a mother of 3 who had died alone on a bathroom floor. The sentencing hearing 3 months later would be even more emotional. Becky's sister Sarah stood at the podium and delivered words that cut through the formal atmosphere of the courtroom like a blade. She spoke directly to Tim, the man she had once considered family, the father of her nephews, the person she now believed had destroyed their lives forever. Your children's future will be forever impacted by your crime, she said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. They are already suffering. Maybe you should have Googled childhood PTSD between your internet searches for homemade silencers and VIN numbers. It was a devastating moment that captured the true cost of this tragedy. 3 young boys had lost their mother to violence and their father to prison. They would grow up knowing that the 2 people who were supposed to protect them above all else had instead become locked in a battle that ended with one dead and the other condemned to die behind bars. Judge Robert Adrian had the option of sentencing Tim to anywhere between 45 years and life without parole. He chose the harshest penalty available, telling Tim that he had researched the murder, planned it, and executed it with a coldness that demanded the ultimate punishment. You broke into her house and you shot her 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 times, the judge said, his voice rising with each number. The court believes that the appropriate sentence would be natural life in prison. Life without the possibility of parole. Tim Bleefnick would never see freedom again. He would never attend another of his children's baseball games or school plays. He would never walk them down the aisle at their weddings or hold his grandchildren. The man who had once stood on a game show stage and joked about regretting his marriage would spend the rest of his days in a concrete cell, paying for what the jury believed was the ultimate expression of that regret. But even as Tim was led away in shackles, questions remained. His defense team immediately announced plans to appeal, maintaining that their client had been convicted on circumstantial evidence and speculation rather than concrete proof. They argued that the real killer was still out there, that justice had not been served but perverted. The prosecutors disagreed. They believed they had followed the evidence exactly where it led them, building a case piece by piece until the truth became undeniable. The shell casings, the DNA fragments, the surveillance footage, the internet searches, the timing of the murder, all of it pointed to one inescapable conclusion. For the community of Quincy, the trial's end brought a mixture of relief and sadness. The streets were safe again, but the cost had been enormous. A beloved nurse was gone forever. 3 children were orphaned. A family was shattered beyond repair, and the illusion of safety that small towns cherish had been stripped away by the recognition that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. The case would be remembered not just for its brutality, but for the way it revealed how domestic violence can escalate in shadows, how warning signs can be missed or dismissed, and how the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones who pose the greatest danger. Becky's final text message to her sister, the one predicting that if something happened to her, Tim should be the first suspect, became a haunting reminder that victims of domestic abuse often know their fate long before anyone else recognizes the danger. She had tried to protect herself through the legal system, through restraining orders and custody battles, but in the end, the system had failed her when she needed it most. Today, Tim Bleefnick sits in an Illinois maximum security prison, maintaining his innocence and fighting his conviction through the appeals process. His children are being raised by Becky's parents, trying to build new lives from the wreckage of unimaginable tragedy. And somewhere in a television archive, that Family Feud episode still exists. A bizarre time capsule of a moment when a joke about marriage regret seemed harmless and funny, rather than prophetic and chilling. It serves as a reminder that we never really know the people around us as well as we think we do, and that sometimes the most ordinary moments can take on extraordinary significance when viewed through the lens of tragedy. The game show and the murder. 2 seemingly unconnected events that became forever linked in one of the most shocking criminal cases in recent memory. A reminder that truth, as they say, can indeed be stranger than fiction.